It happened on a quiet, random Tuesday night. I just finished a late grocery run, half zoning out, pushing my cart down the snack aisle. I was thinking about all the responsible, adult things I needed to pick up when I noticed something bright blue and orange on the bottom shelf. It was a bag of Shark Bites, the gummy snacks. Instantly, I was back in second grade, sitting on the worn carpet in my old elementary school classroom, waiting for lunch to start. I'm telling you, I felt the years melt away. I picked up the bag like it was some rare artifact. It looked different than it used to, but there it was. That unmistakable bold packaging, each gummy shaped like a tiny, smiling shark. I couldn't help but grin. In a flash, I remembered how my friends and I would trade our Shark Bites at lunch. We'd each get super serious about it, offering deals like, "I'll give you my great white if you give me both of your blue sharks." The great white was a big deal back then, a prized rare shark like it was some kind of currency. I could see the lunchroom table again, the weird, bumpy texture of the plastic trays. The juice box we always struggled to open without squirting half of it onto our shirts. The smell of cafeteria pizza came back to me. The one that was suspiciously rectangular and tasted like cardboard, but still somehow felt like a treat. I even remembered the clamor of hundreds of kids talking at once. The scrape of chair legs on the floor, the lunch monitors giving us that look whenever we got a little too rowdy with our trades. For some reason, all of it hit me hard, way more than I'd expect from a silly gummy snack memory. It was like a secret window had opened to all the tiny, beautiful details of a time I didn't even realize I'd forgotten. But it didn't stop there. I remembered that period of my life like it was happening all over again, the little routines, the rules we all made up. There was this one day, every week, we called Free-for-All Friday, when everyone would bring their best snacks for trade. We'd show off our goods like we were running a black market operation. Sometimes I'd sneak an extra bag from home, just to help my trading power. It was this whole economy of fruit snacks and mini cookies and mystery snacks that kids brought back from vacations. Every trade felt like high stakes, like I was a miniature Wall Street trader wheeling and dealing in gummy assets. Standing there in the aisle, I realized how much those little lunchroom deals had meant to us. It sounds silly, but back then, that was our way of making choices, of having a say in our tiny corner of the world. Our lunches were the only part of our day we really controlled, and somehow we'd turned it into this whole little society. I could see each of my old friends in my head, the serious expressions we'd get while inspecting each other's snacks like connoisseurs, making the most careful decisions possible before agreeing to a trade. The rush I'd feel when I scored an extra great white in a trade still made me laugh. I decided to buy the bag. Figured it was only fair after the free nostalgia trip it had just given me. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table, ripping it open carefully just like I would have done back then. I expected to be disappointed, maybe that they'd taste different, or that I'd realize they weren't that great to begin with. But the first bite transported me back. It was pure sugar, way too sweet for an adult palate, but somehow exactly perfect. I could taste every layer of it, like I was back in my childhood lunchroom. And for just a second, I could almost hear the chatter of kids, the excitement of Free-for-All Friday, the sense of endless possibility that came with opening that lunchbox each day. I didn't know it then, but those little moments, those tiny, insignificant snack trades, were teaching us more than we realized. We were learning to share, to negotiate, to value things for more than what they were. And maybe, in some way, they taught us to keep finding joy in the simple things, even if that thing is just a gummy snack shaped like a shark. It's funny how a small, ordinary thing can connect us to a whole world we forgot we were part of. I don't know how long I sat there munching on Shark Bites, but it felt like I'd traveled through time, back to a place where life was easy, free, and filled with the thrill of trading gummies like they were solid gold. So now I'm wondering, what's something random that's brought you back to those small, wonderful moments you might not have thought about in years? Every Sunday morning, for as long as I can remember, my partner and I have had what we call breakfast adventures. I know it sounds silly, but those mornings are a tradition that's become so woven into our lives that it feels almost sacred. It started as a simple habit, a way to make Sunday mornings feel a little more special. But it grew into this thing we both looked forward to all week, a little ritual that somehow makes us feel closer every time. When we first started dating, we were in that phase where everything feels new and electric. We were always looking for new places to explore, so we'd make a little game of it. Every Sunday, we'd find a different place for breakfast. Sometimes it was a tiny diner hidden in the corner of a neighborhood we'd never visited. Other times a fancy cafe with pastries so delicate you almost felt bad eating them. Every spot we tried felt like a new adventure, like we were carving out our own private world. The ritual wasn't about finding the best spot, though. It was about sharing the experience. We'd pick a new place, order something different every time, and spend a couple of hours just being there. Just us, talking about anything and everything, savoring the silence when it came, as the world passed by. And, without realizing it, these breakfasts became little snapshots of our life together. A weekly pause where we'd reconnect. One morning, we ended up at this little cafe I'd spotted a week earlier. It was small, with just a few tables and an old espresso machine that seemed like it might break down any second. They didn't even have a menu, just a board listing a couple of sandwiches, 2 types of coffee, and a handful of pastries in a glass case. The place was run by this older couple who moved at their own pace, completely unbothered by the fact that people had to wait. They'd pour coffee slowly, chatting with each person who came in, treating everyone like a friend rather than a customer. We ordered a couple of croissants and coffees, and the owners came over and told us to take our time, as if they could sense that we needed a slow morning. We sat there, sipping and laughing, feeling like the only 2 people in the world. And somehow, that quiet little cafe, with its faded wallpaper and scratch tables, became one of our places, a spot we'd come back to for anniversaries, birthdays, or even just when one of us needed a pick-me-up. It became a part of us, just like so many other places we'd discovered together. As the years went by, the breakfast adventures became our weekly checkpoint. No matter what else was happening in our lives, Sunday mornings were ours. We'd sit across from each other, sometimes sharing big news, other times just talking about mundane things. The grocery list, plans for the week, funny stories we'd heard. I think what I loved most about those breakfasts was how they made even the ordinary feel special. Somehow, sitting in a little diner with chipped coffee cups felt like the most intimate thing in the world. Just knowing that every Sunday morning we'd have that time together felt like an anchor, something that kept us grounded through all the ups and downs. One Sunday, I remember we ended up at this place by the lake. It was more of a shack than a restaurant, with wobbly tables and benches scattered around the shore. They served these huge, fluffy pancakes with blueberries spilling out of them, practically the size of our heads. We sat by the water, eating, watching the ducks float by, and laughing as the wind kept blowing our napkins off the table. It was a small, messy, perfect morning. I remember thinking, if I could freeze any moment of my life, it would be this one. Just us sitting there together, full and happy. Somewhere along the way, these breakfasts became our unofficial tradition. Whenever things got hard, work stress, family stuff, even our own little arguments, we joked that it would all be sorted out by Sunday morning. And it usually was. There's something about sharing a meal, about sitting across from each other in the soft morning light, that makes everything feel simpler. We'd leave those breakfasts feeling lighter, closer, and somehow reminded that whatever was happening, we'd face it together. When the pandemic hit, our breakfast adventures had to change. Suddenly, there were no cafes, no diners, no hidden spots to discover. I remember that first Sunday after everything shut down. We sat in our kitchen a little deflated, wondering how to keep our ritual alive. Finally, we decided to make our own adventure at home. We got up early, made waffles, and set the table with candles like it was the fanciest restaurant in town. We put on some jazz, dressed up a little, and pretended we were somewhere new. It felt a little ridiculous, but in the best way possible. Over time, we got creative. We'd make themed breakfasts, trying out recipes from different countries. One Sunday, it was French pastries. The next, it was a Mexican-style brunch. Some turned out amazing. Others were more experimental. But we laughed through all of it, making the best of what we had. And looking back, those homemade adventures brought us closer than ever. Even after things opened back up, we still kept our Sunday breakfast tradition alive, sometimes at home, sometimes out. It's funny. Even when we didn't have to, we found ourselves returning to those quiet mornings in our own kitchen. I think we realized it wasn't about where we were or what we were eating, It was the ritual itself that promised to slow down, share a meal, and give each other our full attention, even if just for an hour. Now, every Sunday morning, I wake up with a little thrill of anticipation. It doesn't matter where we go or what we eat. I know that for a couple of hours, we'll be there together, side by side, savoring the little moments, creating memories we'll look back on someday with a smile. Jules and I had been friends since high school, an inseparable duo that felt more like an old married couple than two kids who'd grown up in the same town. She'd been the wild one, the life of the party, while I'd always been the steady, predictable friend who knew when to rein her in. It was the kind of friendship that felt indestructible, like no amount of time or distance could break it. And that's exactly what I'd thought for years. Until the night that flipped my whole world upside down. It was her 29th birthday, and I'd planned a small get-together at my place. I didn't think she'd go for it. Jules hated anything that resembled a routine, but she'd just come out of a brutal breakup, and I figured she could use a night that didn't involve bar hopping or dancing on tables. So, a small, relaxed gathering it was, with just a few friends, some homemade pasta, and plenty of wine. Around midnight, after everyone else had left and the house was quiet, Jules and I were still on the couch, laughing and swapping stories from the night. She was tipsy, her cheeks flushed, her smile a little loopy in that way it always got when she was drunk. She leaned back against the cushions and looked over at me with this lazy, half-lidded grin. "You're my favorite person," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. "Do you know that?" I laughed, brushing it off. "Yeah, you're not so bad yourself." But she didn't laugh. She just kept looking at me, her gaze intense in a way that caught me off guard. And then, before I could process what was happening, she leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't just a peck, either. It was slow and lingering, like something she'd been wanting to do for a while. And I didn't pull away. When she finally drew back, she gave me this look, part surprise and part relief, like she'd just opened a door she couldn't close. "Wow," she said, laughing a little, like she was embarrassed, but also exhilarated. I could feel the adrenaline in my chest, my mind spinning as I tried to wrap my head around what had just happened. Jules was my best friend, the person I'd trusted with every thought, every secret for the past 10 years. And now, she was looking at me like she'd never seen me before. "Let's not overthink this, yeah?" she said, her tone playful, but I could hear the hesitation underneath. And maybe I should have stopped right there. Maybe I should have taken a breath and told her we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But I didn't. That night, we stopped being just friends. The next morning, the sun was streaming through the curtains, and everything felt a little too bright, a little too real. Jules was still asleep, her arm draped over my chest, and for a second, I let myself savor it. But when she woke up, I could see the shift in her eyes, the flash of doubt. She played it off casually, joking about how sleepovers with friends were highly underrated. But there was an edge to her words, a nervousness I hadn't seen in her before. We said our goodbyes with awkward smiles and promises to talk soon, but I think we both knew that the ground had shifted beneath us. The days that followed were strange, filled with stilted texts and forced conversations. We tried to laugh it off, to go back to how things were, but it was like there was a wall between us that hadn't been there before. I kept replaying that night in my head, wondering if I'd made a mistake, if I'd just lost the one person who knew me better than anyone. Finally, after a week of dancing around each other, Jules invited me over. Her apartment looked the same as it always did. Messy, cluttered, full of plants she'd somehow managed not to kill. But the air between us was thick with tension, and I could feel her unease as we sat down on her couch. "I don't know what we're doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This thing between us, it feels like it could either be the best thing that ever happened to us or the absolute worst." Her words hit me hard, echoing exactly what I'd been feeling. We were best friends, but there was this uncharted territory between us now, and neither of us knew how to navigate it. We sat there in silence for a long time, and finally, I reached for her hand. "Look, maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now. Maybe we can just see where this goes." I held my breath, waiting for her reaction, but she just squeezed my hand and nodded, her eyes softening. For a while, It felt like we'd found our rhythm, like we could have the best of both worlds. Friends and something more. There was an ease between us, a comfort that felt natural, and I started to believe we could make it work. But the closer we got, the more complicated it became. Every time she looked at me, every laugh, every shared secret felt loaded with unspoken words. And with each step forward, I could feel her pulling back, afraid of what we might lose if this didn't work out. Then came the night everything unraveled. We were at a mutual friend's birthday party, and she spent most of the evening avoiding my gaze, making excuses to talk to everyone but me. I could feel her drifting, slipping away, and the frustration started to build until I couldn't hold it in any longer. We ended up arguing in her kitchen, our voices low but intense, each of us trying to say things without actually saying them. "I don't get it, Jules," I said, my voice tight. "Why does this have to be so hard?" She looked at me, her face a mixture of pain and confusion. "Because I'm scared, okay?" she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." And there it was, the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to pull her close, to tell her we'd figure it out, but another part of me was terrified too. We were standing on the edge of something huge, something that could either make us or break us. And in that moment, I realized that I'd rather have her as a friend than risk losing her altogether. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. We both tried to go back to how things were, pretending that we could just erase that night, that kiss, the emotions that had tangled up between us. But it was like trying to unring a bell. Every time I saw her, every time we laughed or shared a quiet moment, I felt it, the weight of what we weren't saying, the unspoken truth that had wedged itself between us. Eventually, time did what it does best. The memories faded a little, the awkwardness lessened, and we started to find our way back to each other, though never quite the same as before. It was different, a friendship that bore the scars of something beautiful and messy and real. Now, years later, we're still close, still each other's person. We don't talk about that night anymore, don't acknowledge what almost was. Maybe one day we'll be able to laugh about it. Maybe one day it'll feel like just a footnote in our story. But for now, it's a quiet memory, tucked away, a reminder of the line we crossed and the friendship we fought to save. And if I'm being honest, part of me still wonders. Part of me will probably always wonder. I'd sworn off serious relationships a long time ago. My friends knew it, I knew it, and the guys I met typically learned that quick enough. I told myself I was one of those people who thrived on freedom, who valued experiences over commitments. But sometimes you end up in places you don't expect with people who make you question everything you thought you were certain about. That's exactly what happened on one random Saturday night, the night that's been looping in my mind ever since. I'd been at this house party, the kind where people spill out onto the front lawn. The music competes with your heartbeat, and everyone's teetering on the edge of a good time and a disaster. I wasn't planning on staying long. I had a Sunday yoga class I didn't want to miss. But then I noticed him in the kitchen, standing by himself, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He wasn't the loud, flashy type. He was quiet, with this intense, brooding look. Against the chaos, he was strangely calm, just observing, as if he could see something everyone else was missing. So, naturally, I walked over and introduced myself. His name was Sam, and we started talking over cheap beer and snacks scavenged from the kitchen. At first, I thought he'd just be another fun distraction, someone to pass the time with until the party wound down. But as we talked, I felt this strange pull. We were laughing, leaning in, and before I knew it, hours had passed. He had this subtle humor and these sharp insights that hooked me. We talked about everything from favorite movies to childhood memories, and he didn't hold back on the weird, quirky details either. That's what I liked about him. There was no pretense. Just real, raw conversation. At some point, he looked me straight in the eyes and asked if I wanted to get some fresh air. That's how I found myself on a darkened beach at 2 a.m. The sound of the waves our only backdrop. There was a freedom to it, like we were the only two people in the world cocooned in our little bubble. He took my hand, and even though I'd done this a dozen times with different people, it felt different with him. Something in me softened. We ended up back at his place. We moved like two people who'd known each other longer than a few hours, like every touch was some ancient rhythm. But even as I lost myself in the moment, a part of me hesitated, as if bracing for the inevitable morning awkwardness. I'd been here before, and I knew how these things usually went. You wake up, you make polite small talk, and then you part ways, each pretending it hadn't meant anything. But that's not what happened. I woke up to sunlight spilling into his room, and there he was already awake just watching me. I felt this moment of panic, like he could see right through me. I quickly made an excuse about needing to go home, but he didn't push or guilt trip me. He just nodded, gave me a sleepy smile, and told me he'd had a great time. Walking home, I felt strange, unsettled. I'd had my share of casual hookups, but this one lingered, casting a shadow I couldn't shake. I told myself that these encounters were purely physical, just for fun, no strings attached. But Sam had cut through my defenses, made me feel things I wasn't ready to feel. For days, I tried to dismiss it, to treat it like any other fleeting experience. But his face kept surfacing in my mind at the most random times, when I was at work during my yoga class, even when I was brushing my teeth. Finally, a week later, I broke. I texted him, casually at first, trying not to give away how much he'd been on my mind. To my relief, he was just as warm, just as genuine as he'd been that night. We met up for coffee, and before I knew it, I found myself letting my guard down, admitting things I'd never told anyone before. He listened, really listened, and didn't judge or try to offer solutions. I could tell he had his own walls, his own scars, but there was this openness between us that felt rare and fragile. One night turned into several dates, and I found myself rethinking everything I thought I knew about myself. I'd always been the girl who couldn't commit, who didn't believe in the fairy tale endings. But with him, things felt different, like maybe I was allowed to want something more, something lasting. I don't know where this will go, and honestly, that terrifies me. But maybe, just maybe, I'm ready to take that. All right, I'm diving in here because I feel like you all won't judge, right? And I'm dying to know if anyone else does something like this. So here goes. I run little relationship experiments in my head. But it's not just daydreaming, like, oh, what if we dated? No, this is a whole organized mental test run, complete with simulated relationship scenarios. Think of it as a mini role play that I conduct in my brain. Here's how it started. I once had a crush on this girl I'll call Emma, and I realized I had no idea if we'd even get along for more than a conversation. But I liked her so much that I needed to know what being in a relationship with her would be like. So I started to imagine scenarios, different situations we might face if we were actually dating, and how she'd react. And here's the kicker. I try to make them challenging. It's like my own personal relationship test lab, where I see if a crush could theoretically survive the ups and downs before we're even remotely close to dating. So, for Emma, I'd imagine things like, what if we got stuck in a 5-hour traffic jam? Or how would she react if I forgot her birthday? In my head, I'd play out these situations with Emma, imagining her responses, my responses, and sometimes it'd get so real that I'd feel this little pang of imaginary heartbreak if we broke up over one of these fights. Yeah, I break up with my crushes in my head before we've even had coffee together. Welcome to my brain. It might sound bizarre, but this little experiment has helped me avoid a few disasters. For instance, I had a crush on this guy named Mark who seemed perfect on paper. Hilarious, tall, the kind of person who'd remember your dog's name before he remembered yours. Anyway, we'd only had a couple of group hangouts together, but I was convinced I'd marry him after one of our shared jokes landed. So well it felt like fireworks. But then, in my relationship lab, I imagined us on a stressful travel trip. Specifically, I ran a simulation where we're stuck at the airport for 8 hours because our flight got delayed. In my mind's eye, I watched as Airport Mark handled the delay by throwing a quiet but undeniable fit, ordering me to demand answers at the counter, even after I said the staff had no control over the situation. Imaginary Mark got so cranky and pushy about the whole ordeal that I ended up breaking up with him right there at Gate B4. And that was it, crush over. I knew that if he'd really been that kind of person, I'd have ended up tired and annoyed, not in love, The imaginary version was enough for me to realize he might not be the one for my imaginary apocalypse survival team. So I let him go, without him ever knowing he'd been dumped in my mind. But it's not all heartbreak in my relationship lab. There are moments of pure, unreasonable joy, too. When I had a crush on this barista named Daniel, I'd imagine these elaborate, ridiculous scenarios like, what if we had a team up at a paintball game? Spoiler, imaginary Daniel was amazing at paintball. Or, I'd try to imagine him helping me cook when I clearly had no idea what I was doing. He'd pretend to teach me how to saute vegetables while I purposely messed up to make him laugh. These were some of my favorite experiments because by the end, I convinced myself I'd found my soulmate in this guy who'd barely learned my name at the coffee shop. But my experiments do have a downside. Because I've invested so much time in these fake scenarios, it sometimes feels real to me. So when my real crush doesn't match up to the imaginary version, like let's say Daniel doesn't even like paintball in real life, it's weirdly disappointing. I almost have to grieve the end of the imaginary relationship, even though it never even started. Like, I once imagined a whole comfort me through a rough day scenario with a guy, only to find out in real life that he was so awkward with emotions. He couldn't even console his friend over a job loss. My imaginary version had been all supportive and understanding. So when real him stumbled through a basic there, I felt this ridiculous pang of betrayal, as if my internal version of him had cheated on me with reality. There's one scenario that plays on loop for nearly every crush, though, and I call it the ideal Saturday. It's like my ultimate compatibility test. Here's how it goes. We wake up late on a Saturday, eat breakfast, or skip it and go straight to lunch because why not? Then we spend a lazy afternoon doing whatever, go to a bookstore, finding random places to people watch, something that doesn't take much planning. And then there's a cozy night in where we order takeout, talk until midnight, and end the day binge watching a show together. In my head, if I can imagine doing all of that with them and it still feels fun and natural, that's the green light to let my crush grow. One time, though, my imagination went off the rails. I had a major crush on this woman I worked with, and I'd run so many imaginary scenarios with her that it felt like we'd been dating for months. We'd been through imaginary holidays, imaginary meet-the-family dinners, even imaginary therapy sessions where we'd worked through issues like her hypothetical fear of commitment. Then one day, she mentioned she was seeing someone, and I had to remind myself that she had never, not even once, been part of any of this in real life. I felt this mini wave of jealousy, like who's this guy invading our relationship? Only to remember that she was just a kind coworker who probably had no clue I'd imagined a whole saga of our romance without her involvement. And yeah, my friends would probably laugh if they knew how much effort I put into these relationship tests without anyone's knowledge. I think I do it because there's something comforting in having a preview before getting hurt, like a built-in safety net. Plus, it lets me be a little reckless in my imagination because I can test the limits of what I want in a relationship without risking real-life consequences. So there it is, my totally unnecessary, completely over-the-top way of handling my love life before it even exists. But hey, it keeps things interesting, and it means I'll never be blindsided by a bad imaginary first date. Alright, confession over. Please tell me someone else has little quirks or rituals when they're crushing on someone. Or am I just out here running a private relationship test lab by myself? It all started with a phone that I hadn't planned on answering. It was Saturday morning, and I was in full lazy mode, still in my pajamas, scrolling aimlessly, a half-finished coffee next to me. My friend Elena called, buzzing with excitement about some pop-up art event downtown that she'd heard about through a friend of a friend. Normally, I'd come up with some excuse, but for some reason, her energy caught me off guard, and before I knew it, I'd agreed to meet her. As I stepped out the door, a random drizzle started, and I took it as a sign that maybe this day had plans for me that I hadn't considered yet. On a whim, I grabbed an umbrella, one I'd found at a flea market a few years back. It was faded green with tiny gold stars embroidered along the edges, an impulse buy that I'd barely used but could never quite let go of. The whole thing felt oddly charming in a way I couldn't quite put into words. The event was held in this old warehouse that had been converted into an artist collective space. The entrance was lined with fairy lights, and a huge, hand-painted banner read, "Come find your color." I could hear Elena calling my name before I even saw her. She looked like she belonged there. In a red beret and a scarf, she had somehow turned into a whole outfit. She handed me a wristband and led me inside. The place was nothing like I'd imagined. Instead of the stark white walls and abstract pieces I'd expected, it felt like I'd walked into a maze of mismatched colors and scenes. Each room had a different theme. One was painted in shades of teal, another in warm, golden hues. One corner had been transformed into a mini jungle, complete with real plants and the sounds of birds chirping somewhere overhead. In another, a troupe of dancers spun slowly to soft jazz, casting shadows across a wall covered in hand-drawn constellations. After a while, Elena and I got separated in the crowd, and I didn't mind. I felt a kind of strange pull, like something was guiding me through the rooms. I wandered, getting lost in little details. A corner filled with hanging paper cranes, a room where feathers fell softly from the ceiling, and a mirror-covered hallway that made you feel like you'd slipped into a dream. I took photos here and there, but mostly I just drifted, letting the whole experience soak in. At one point, I ended up in a quiet room, lit only by dim lamps, the walls painted in deep, stormy blues. In the center of the room was a single exhibit, a wooden table covered in tiny glass jars, each with a small scroll inside. A sign hung above it, messages for the wanderers. I reached out, hesitating, then picked one up and unrolled it. It read, "Sometimes the things you seek are closer than you think." I smiled, feeling like the universe was winking at me. But then, I noticed a faint reflection in one of the mirrors along the wall. There was a guy standing behind me, quietly watching the same exhibit. He was tall, with a camera slung around his neck, and a look that suggested he was as lost in the moment as I was. I recognized him from earlier, glancing around a few of the rooms like he was on a mission. We made eye contact, and he smiled, nodding to the jar in my hand. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, his voice quiet, as if he didn't want to disturb the magic of the room. I shrugged, a little self-conscious. "Just a bit of advice, I guess. Something about things being closer than I think." He grinned, pulling out a scroll of his own. "Mine says, 'Everywhere you go becomes part of you somehow.' Kind of fitting, don't you think?" We laughed, and for a second, it felt like the rest of the world had blurred into the background. We started talking, falling into one of those conversations that seemed to skip right past small talk and dive into the good stuff. His name was Lucas, and he was a photographer who traveled for his work, but had somehow ended up in my city, looking for inspiration. He said he hadn't planned on staying long, but this place had a way of making him linger. After a while, he asked if I wanted to explore the rest of the exhibit together, and I found myself saying yes. The rooms kept surprising us. There was a hall filled with mismatched mirrors that made us look like we were part of a fun house, a rooftop setup with a skyline painted in soft purples, and even a room with a small garden and a single bench in the middle. We spent hours wandering through it all, talking and laughing, exchanging stories about travels and favorite songs, and eventually forgetting the people we were supposed to be. Toward the end of the exhibit, we reached a little outdoor garden area. Tiny lights were strung up in the trees, flickering like stars, and it felt like we'd somehow stepped into another world entirely. Without thinking, I opened the umbrella and held it up for both of us as we walked. The drizzle had started again, but it felt more refreshing than inconvenient, like the weather had joined in on the fun. Standing there under the umbrella, Lucas looked at me and said, "I don't usually believe in fate, but today feels a little like magic, doesn't it?" I nodded, feeling oddly moved. "Yeah, it really does." We didn't exchange numbers. Maybe it was the enchantment of the day, but we both just knew. Some things are meant to be memories. Little gifts that life gives you, unplanned and perfect, like a glimpse into a world that's just a bit more magical than our own. After he left, I stayed a little longer, watching the lights flicker, feeling that mixture of happiness and nostalgia that only comes with experiences that you know are rare. As I walked back home, I couldn't help but feel like that day had been something precious, a reminder that sometimes the universe has a plan, even if we can't see it. So, have you ever had a day that felt like a page out of a storybook? A day that felt a little bit like magic? This little story starts, like so many good stories, with caffeine. So, I have this ritual. Every morning, without fail, I wake up, stagger to the kitchen, and pour myself a big cup of coffee. We're not talking about any fancy pour-over or French press here. Just my trusty drip coffee maker that's been with me since college, faithfully sputtering out the liquid magic I need to function. I've been using this machine for years, and frankly, I'm convinced it's the only thing keeping me on this side of consciousness each morning. But then, one tragic Thursday, my old friend decided it was time to retire. I shuffled to the kitchen, filled the machine with water and grounds, pressed the button, and nothing. Just a sad, lifeless silence. I pressed the button again, unplugged it, replugged it, shook it a bit, as if a gentle shake would magically resurrect it. But nope. My trusty coffee maker was gone, leaving me coffeeless, bewildered, and suddenly very awake in the worst possible way. Now, I know what you're thinking. Just make some instant coffee and move on with your day, right? Or go to a cafe. But I was too attached to my routine, too rattled by the break in my usual rhythm. So I just sat there, staring at this dead coffee maker, feeling a weird combination of grief and denial. That's when something bizarre happened. I started thinking, if this coffee maker could talk, what would it say? Look, I was caffeine deprived, okay? Don't judge. I realized this machine had been through my whole adult life with me, quietly sitting there every day, helping me through late-night study sessions, early morning work deadlines, heartbreaks, celebrations, everything. It was almost like the thing had its own personality, steady, dependable, always there, just doing its job. And now it was gone, and I hadn't even seen it coming. So here I am, sitting in my kitchen, realizing I'd been going through the motions of my life in the same way I went through my coffee routine. Every day was more or less the same. Work, errands, scroll through my phone, rinse, repeat. I'd gotten so comfortable with my routines that I wasn't even fully awake to them anymore. I just let the days slip by, content with good enough, because hey, good enough felt safe and easy. But was it actually making me happy? Or was I just coasting? I ended up taking that day off from work. I know it sounds dramatic, but I suddenly felt like I needed some time to figure out what else I'd been doing on autopilot. So, instead of running to the nearest store for a new coffee maker, I decided to change up my morning routine completely. I went for a walk, breathing in the crisp morning air and trying to feel truly awake without the caffeine kickstart. I tried to pay attention to the sounds around me, to the sun filtering through the trees, and for the first time in who knows how long, I felt a little lighter. Over the next few days, I leaned into this new approach. I started giving myself time in the morning to just be, to journal, to stretch, to have tea instead of coffee, to enjoy the quiet before the day got loud. And weirdly enough, I found I was okay without my coffee crutch. I missed it, sure, but I didn't feel so dependent on it. Losing my coffee maker had forced me out of a rut I hadn't even noticed I'd dug myself into. Eventually, I did buy a new coffee maker, and yes, I went back to drinking my morning coffee. Some habits are just too good to quit. But now it feels different. I'm a little more present, a little more grateful. I actually notice that first sip each morning and savor it instead of downing it mindlessly while scrolling through emails. That broken coffee maker woke me up in a way caffeine never could. So, here's my question to you. Have you ever had a small, random inconvenience that ended up waking you up to a bigger part of your life? It started with a piano. A faint melody drifted out of an open door as I passed a quiet building on my way to grab takeout. The music was wistful, soft, so much so that I thought it was a recording until I heard a few tentative notes, like someone making up the tune as they went along. I paused outside, not wanting to intrude, but something in me felt compelled to listen just a little longer. "Are you just going to stand there and listen, or come in?" came a voice from the doorway. Startled, I looked up and saw her. She was sitting at the piano, head tilted slightly, with a mischievous smile playing at the corners of her lips. She was about my age, maybe a bit younger, and her confidence threw me off guard. "Oh, I was just passing by," I stammered, caught completely off guard. She raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "Really? All right." I admitted, the music drew me in. I guess I wasn't expecting anyone to catch me standing there. "Good. It's nice to know I can stop a stranger in his tracks." She laughed lightly, inviting me in with a nod. "You don't look like the piano type. Do you play?" I shook my head. "Not really. I'm more of a listener. Besides, I'd probably mess up whatever you were playing." She tapped a few random notes, her fingers dancing lightly over the keys. Oh, I wasn't playing anything in particular. Just something that felt right for the moment. She looked at me with curious eyes, as if she were dissecting the nature of my presence. What brings you here anyway? Were you planning on playing detective in the doorways of every random piano player you stumble across? Something like that. I joked, smiling a little. No, actually, I was just on my way to grab some food. But then, I don't know, I guess I just couldn't help stopping to listen. She seemed amused by my answer, her fingers still hovering over the keys. It's funny, how strangers can find themselves in the same place at the same time, sharing this tiny moment they might never have again. I nodded, feeling strangely comfortable in her presence, as if we'd slipped into a quiet, alternate universe. There was a rhythm to her way of talking, a kind of calm confidence that seemed to put me at ease. Well, now that you're here, she said, a gleam in her eye. Do you want to give it a go? Play something, even if it's just a few notes. She scooted over on the bench, leaving a space for me. No way, I laughed, shaking my head. I'd embarrass myself completely. She shrugged, playful. We're already strangers. What's the worst that could happen? You mess up, we laugh about it, and you go get your takeout. No harm, no fault. I couldn't help but be drawn in by her carefree attitude. And so, feeling a bit ridiculous, I sat beside her, facing the massive stretch of black and white keys. I glanced at her, as if hoping she'd give me some kind of magical insight into the art of improvisation. Just pick any note, she instructed gently. Let your fingers wander, and don't overthink it. Her voice was calm, like she'd done this 100 times. And so, with no plan at all, I tapped one of the keys. A single note rang out, and I chuckled nervously, feeling like a kid trying to sound grown up. See? Not so bad, she encouraged. Then, she joined in, adding a simple melody to the notes I was playing. It was far from perfect, but it sounded better than I could have managed on my own. We went on like this for a few minutes, just adding notes here and there, creating something that felt utterly unique and transient. When we finally stopped, I looked at her, both amused and impressed. You make it look easy. You should be a teacher or something. She laughed. Nah, I don't have the patience for that. But I like moments like these, where you can just play without any expectations. Her voice grew softer, as if sharing something she rarely said out loud. Life feels so planned sometimes. It's nice to have a little chaos. I nodded, feeling a strange connection with her words. It does, doesn't it? Like everything's set in stone, and you're just ticking boxes as you go along. She looked at me thoughtfully, as if she were seeing straight through to the part of me that understood what she meant. Maybe we all need more little interruptions then. Small surprises, things that just happen, like a stranger listening to a song through a doorway. I laughed, realizing how surreal this moment felt, like something out of a film. Maybe so. It's funny, I didn't expect my night to go like this. She shrugged, smiling. I think that's the best part. And, by the way, you're not half bad for a guy who claims he doesn't play. Her words left me both flattered and slightly embarrassed. She made it sound like I'd done something special, even though I'd barely tapped a handful of notes. We shared a quiet laugh, and as I glanced at the clock, I realized I'd been here longer than expected. I should probably get going, I said, reluctantly standing up. But hey, thank you. That was something I didn't know I needed. She gave me a warm smile, something genuine and rare. That's what music's for, right? To give you something you didn't know you needed. As I reached the doorway, I felt a pang of regret, almost like I was leaving too soon. I wanted to ask her name, maybe get her number, but I knew that might ruin it. This wasn't meant to be a typical encounter. It was one of those ephemeral moments that would lose its magic if I tried to hold on too tightly. Instead, I turned and simply said, I hope our paths cross again someday. She waved a small, knowing smile on her face. Maybe they will. Who knows? After all, there's always music. And with that, I left, walking out into the night with a newfound lightness. The world felt different somehow, as if that unexpected tune had slipped into my thoughts, echoing softly as I made my way down the street. I could still hear those last few notes trailing behind me, fading into the quiet of the evening. As I walked, I thought about how rare it is to meet someone like that, a stranger who somehow shifts your perspective without even meaning to. It was such a fleeting, unplanned moment, yet it felt more real than most of the conversations I'd had in recent memory. And even though I hadn't gotten her name, hadn't tried to force the moment into something more, it felt perfect. A beautiful, accidental harmony that would linger with me. One of those tiny memories you carry long after the night has faded. When I finally reached the takeout place, I couldn't help but smile to myself, feeling like maybe there was a bit more magic in the world than I'd given it credit for. And as I left with my food, I realized that, somewhere out there, she was probably sitting at that piano, weaving her next melody, creating a new moment for another passing string. Today was off to a peculiar start. When I woke up, the morning sun had somehow managed to project itself right onto my ceiling in a perfect square. Not sunlight coming through the window, kind of square, no, this was like a painting. A square of sun, glowing warmly as if someone had literally pinned it up there. I stared at it for a good minute, waiting for it to blink or give me a sign that my ceiling hadn't suddenly turned into a gallery for the celestial arts. Then, just as I was wondering if I should say something to it, the square sunlight blinked and moved to a new corner, like it was showing me a tour of the morning. And all I could think was, well, that's considerate. On my way downstairs, I realized that every object in my house had a bit more character than usual. The hallway mirror gave me a quick thumbs up, a feeling, not an actual thumbs up, but close enough that I muttered a quiet thank you. The kettle, humming in anticipation of my arrival, had somehow decided to whistle a familiar tune instead of its usual high-pitched scream. It was Here Comes the Sun, a fitting choice considering the artistic light show upstairs. I gave it a nod, feeling strangely comforted by the collaboration of my kitchen appliances to make my morning a gentle one. Once outside, things continued in this odd, dreamy fashion. The sidewalk was almost rolling with laughter under my feet. Yes, rolling. Not in the loud way, mind you. It was more like a soft chuckle, as if it was pleased that I decided to step outside. I felt a little self-conscious, suddenly, like I'd somehow dressed up for an invisible audience. But as I adjusted my collar and walked on, I noticed other people walking in a similar kind of trance, just playing along like everything was perfectly normal. A woman across the street gave me a wave. Not with her hand, but with her shadow, which flickered up from the pavement to wave before slipping back into place. I waved back, not sure if she'd even noticed the uncanny behavior of her own shadow. My first stop was the corner bakery, which was busier than usual. Everyone seemed to be hovering around the counter, as if debating something important in hushed tones. I took my place in line, and soon, a friendly hunk of sourdough caught my eye. It sat there on the counter, looking very satisfied with itself, almost daring me to pick it. So, I gave it a polite nod, thinking, challenge accepted, and before I knew it, I was holding a loaf that seemed far too pleased to be taken home. The cashier, meanwhile, was moving in slow motion, as if each bagel needed to be gently convinced to join its buyer. The most curious part? No one seemed annoyed. It was like everyone had agreed to a slower pace today, not out of patience, but out of genuine respect for bagels. Whatever was in the air had settled us all into a strange sense of shared ritual. Even my sourdough loaf gave a contented sigh as it slipped into the bag. I patted it gently, thinking you'll be fine before heading out. The street outside had been transformed. The street signs were, for some reason, now giving different kinds of advice. Stop had been replaced with wait a second, while yield had shifted to go ahead if you're sure. I found myself obeying the new commands without question. I waited a second at the crosswalk, feeling a comfortable, almost sage-like pause that seemed to tell me there's no rush here. As I crossed, I could have sworn the painted lines underfoot murmured something encouraging like, "Steady now," in an ancient, creaky voice. Just then, a pigeon flew down and landed right in my path, giving me a very appraising look. It tilted its head like it was assessing my character and my choice of footwear. I was almost expecting it to say something like decent shoes, mate, or those laces could use a double knot, but it merely ruffled its feathers in approval before waddling off with what looked like a shrug. And really, that was the general mood of the day. Everyone seemed to be nodding, shrugging, or exchanging subtle glances that meant more than words ever could. As I wandered further into town, it seemed like the buildings themselves had joined in on the fun. The old clock tower, which usually seemed too dignified to engage with mere mortals, now had an easygoing look about it, as though it had been waiting for me specifically to notice it. I swear it winked as I looked up. Then it did something truly surprising. The hands began to spin, quickly settling on a new time entirely, one that was, by my best estimate, about an hour earlier than reality. I stared at my phone, which had obediently adjusted to this time warp without any complaint. I suppose that time itself was in on the joke. I ducked into a nearby bookstore, curious to see if the books, too, were taking part in today's strange magic. Sure enough, they were. One of the books I pulled from the shelf, a dusty red hardcover, practically opened itself to a page that read, "You're in exactly the right place." I sat down right there, feeling like I'd stumbled into the coziest corner of the universe. A few pages later, the book kindly suggested that I might want a cup of tea. Before I knew it, the shop owner was setting down a cup beside me, as if he knew exactly what I'd read. I gave him a knowing smile, to which he only shrugged and walked off, as though to say, "Don't overthink it, pal." After finishing my tea, which, let's be honest, tasted like it had been made by a tea kettle that personally knew me, I decided to wander back home, feeling like I'd just had the most relaxing and strange therapy session of my life. The square sun had finally moved off my ceiling and back into the sky, casting everything in that soft, late afternoon glow that felt like it was giving the day one last tender hug. As I walked back, my street welcomed me as if returning from a long journey. The flower beds along the sidewalk seemed to whisper among themselves something about home safe and good day, and I gave them a nod, feeling oddly validated by the approval of my neighborhood flora. When I reached my door, I turned back to the world, gave it a quick wink, and murmured, "Thanks for the strange hospitality today." It didn't answer, of course, but I'd like to think the world winked back. So, if you woke up in a world where things gently tilted into the absurd, what would you do with your day? It started with a coffee spill. I was rushing through a cramped, bustling bookstore, balancing an oversized latte and a paperback copy of some self-help book I'd picked up for reasons that escaped me the moment I saw the cashier's line. I glanced down to read the back cover, and suddenly, splash! Hot coffee spilled everywhere, including on the shoes of the poor person standing next to me. I fumbled out apologies, mortified, and tried to wipe the splash marks off my victim's shoes with a napkin that only made it worse. "No worries," he laughed, eyeing the napkin massacre. He wore a vintage leather jacket and had this vaguely familiar face, like someone you'd think you'd recognize on the street. If anything, it's a sign I've had these shoes too long. We chatted awkwardly, and I learned his name was Lucas. He was a musician and was just killing time, waiting for a friend. When he saw the book in my hand, he grinned. "Tell you what, I'll get you a new coffee if you toss that book and come with me. I'm headed to this little art show down the street. Could be fun." I hesitated, my internal safety alarms flashing. But maybe it was the vibe in the bookstore or the way he smiled, genuinely amused by the absurd coffee fiasco. Or maybe I just wanted to shake things up. I accepted his offer, ditched the self-help book on the nearest shelf, and we headed out. We wandered down a narrow side street, and soon we reached a building with no sign, just an open door and the faint sound of classical guitar echoing from somewhere inside. The place was dimly lit, with string lights and clusters of candles scattered around. Small paintings and abstract sculptures lined the walls, and a few people, artists I assumed, were lounging around, talking in low voices. Lucas gave a small wave to a guy in a beret who acknowledged us with a lazy nod, then led me deeper into the gallery. One wall was covered with photographs, all black and white, each one capturing different city scenes: crowded sidewalks, crumbling buildings, someone laughing on a park bench. They were ordinary moments, but there was something hauntingly beautiful about them. I leaned in to examine one photo of an old man holding an umbrella, his face half hidden in shadow. It was mesmerizing, like you could feel the rain and hear his footsteps. "Do you ever wonder about the stories behind these people?" Lucas whispered, standing close enough that I could smell a faint hint of woodsy cologne. "Like, who they are and where they're going?" I nodded. "Yeah, I mean, everyone's got this whole hidden life, right? And here we are, just catching glimpses. He grinned and grabbed a folded piece of paper from his pocket, scribbling something on it before handing it to me. "Play a game with me?" It read in his quick, messy handwriting. I was intrigued and nodded, feeling that tingle of adventure in my fingertips. He gestured to the crowd and explained the game. Each of us would pick a stranger from the gallery and make up a life story for them. It had to be something wild, unexpected, but it had to feel true, like a secret that could explain the person's every gesture, every subtle expression. I scanned the room and zeroed in on a woman in a red coat, standing by herself, studying a painting. She had a deep frown of concentration, and every few minutes, she'd reach up and tug on a lock of her hair. "All right," I said. "See her? That's Marianne. She's an ex-jewel thief, but she's in hiding now. She used to pull off heists across Europe, wore wigs, fancy clothes, used fake names. She was like this chameleon. She gave it all up after her last big score, but she kept a single diamond as a keepsake. And now, once a year, she goes to an art gallery just like this one, in a different city each time, and she wears the diamond hidden in her coat pocket just to remind herself of her past life." Lucas listened, his eyes wide, a huge grin spreading across his face. "That's amazing. A retired jewel thief, looking for her own life in a painting." He pointed to an older man leaning against the bar with a cane. "Okay, so that guy? His name is Richard. He was a world-class chef until a freak accident cost him his sense of taste. It ruined him. He lost his job, his reputation. Even his family didn't know what to do with him. Now he spends his nights in art galleries, hoping that something, maybe a color, maybe the way light hits a painting, will remind him of what it was like to taste again." As we went back and forth, creating these little lives for strangers, the night seemed to slow down. I almost forgot we'd only just met, caught up in the spell of our game. There was something so freeing about it, like we were weaving our own little universe within this art gallery. At some point, Lucas looked over at me and said, "All right, your turn. Make up a story about me." The request caught me off guard. I looked at him, really looked at him, the vintage jacket, the scar on his eyebrow, the way his eyes seemed to be laughing even when he wasn't smiling. And then, without overthinking, I started. "You're a ghostwriter," I said, watching his reaction. "You've written novels that have topped bestseller lists, but no one knows it's you. You don't even use a pen name. You let other people take all the credit. You're just content to be in the background. And maybe it's because, one time, you fell in love with a character you wrote, and you couldn't bear to let anyone know, so you stayed a ghost. You're here tonight because you've finally decided to stop hiding, to maybe let the world know who you really are." He laughed, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression, something that made me wonder if I'd hit closer to the truth than I realized. "Well, if that's true, then I guess it's your lucky night," he said, lifting his glass in a toast. "To secrets, and to finding them in the unlikeliest places." Eventually, the gallery started to thin out, and we decided to leave. The night was chilly, and I wrapped my scarf a little tighter around my neck as we strolled through the now quiet streets. I had no idea where we were going, and I didn't ask. We wandered into a small, candlelit cafe that smelled like cinnamon and coffee, one of those hidden places you'd never notice during the day. We kept talking, sharing stories, our voices low, as if we were afraid of disturbing the spell of the evening. At one point, he reached across the table and held my hand, just for a moment, like he needed the connection as much as I did. But as all strange and beautiful nights do, this one had to end. We walked back to the bookstore where we'd met, the same place I'd spilled coffee on his shoes, and he stopped just outside the door. "I don't usually do this," he said, looking down as if searching for the right words. "But tonight was something else. I'd like to keep in touch." I was about to give him my number when he shook his head. "No, let's do something different," he said. "If we're meant to meet again, we'll run into each other. Call it fate." With a small smile, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner before I could even process what had happened. Days turned into weeks, and life settled back into its usual rhythm. But I never quite forgot that night. I walked through that part of the city more often, wondering if I'd spot him or if he'd simply remain a fleeting, magical memory. And every so often, I'd pass by that gallery or find myself back in that cafe, half expecting to see him there, waiting. Maybe one day, I'll turn the corner and spot him again, waiting with that mischievous grin and a new story to share. So, tell me, have you ever met a stranger who changed the way you see the world, even if just for a... Okay, this story takes place one summer during my early college years when I thought adventure was anything involving a car, a questionable amount of gas money, and absolutely no planning. I had just wrapped up a solo road trip visiting my cousin out of state and was headed back home, feeling untouchable, like some fearless Lone Ranger, if Lone Rangers still had to call their parents at night to check in. I was somewhere in the middle of a long, mostly empty highway, with only dry fields and occasional roadkill to keep me company when I saw it. Up ahead, at the side of the road, a guy was leaning on the hood of his car, waving his arms like he was flagging down an airplane. My immediate reaction was what I'd call textbook stranger danger. Do not stop. Drive right past. But as I got closer, I could see he looked harmless, a bit sweaty, maybe, but just a guy in his mid-50s with a Hawaiian shirt and khaki shorts looking about as lost as a tourist on Mars. I pulled over, rolled my window down, and asked if he was all right. He smiled with this mix of relief and embarrassment, saying his car had overheated and asking if I happened to have any water. Now, my instinct was to keep a healthy distance, but the guy looked desperate, so I dug around in my back seat, pulled out a water bottle, and handed it over. I figured I'd done my good deed for the day and could be on my way. But right as I was about to drive off, he looked up and asked, "You wouldn't happen to know anything about cars, would you?" Now, I knew next to nothing about cars, beyond how to pop the hood and jumpstart one. But something made me stop and think, what's the worst that could happen? So I parked and walked over to his car, trying to look like I knew what I was doing. It turns out that he'd ignored some warning light, classic, and his radiator was bone dry. I'm standing there, half listening to him describe the symptoms, when I realized that he's got a whole car full of camping supplies. Like, fully packed. As we're chatting, I find out he'd been driving across states to meet up with his son for a camping trip. But his son had ended up in a hospital. Nothing too serious, thankfully. And so he was just stuck here, alone on the highway. All plans derailed, waiting for help. I don't know what came over me, but I felt this urge to actually do something for the guy. So I called up a local tow company to arrange a lift. And while we waited, we ended up sitting there on the guardrail, sweating it out under the sun, swapping life stories. He told me all about his son, his late wife, how this trip had been planned for months. He was clearly trying to stay positive, but he'd be lying if he said he wasn't a little bummed out. His stories made me feel like I'd known him for ages. To kill time, he offered me some snacks, specifically homemade beef jerky he'd made for the trip. And I can't describe it any other way than legendary. If they handed out jerky medals, he'd have one. We sat there like old friends, the world whizzing by on that empty highway, eating jerky and talking about everything and nothing. We both ended up with bad sunburns and dust in our shoes, but it somehow felt like the most perfectly imperfect day. After a while, the tow truck finally arrived. As he was getting set to leave, he insisted on giving me some money for gas, but I told him to keep it. I don't know why. Maybe it was the jerky, or maybe it was that something you feel when you know an interaction was worth more than cash. But what he said as we were parting really hit me. He looked at me and said, "Thank you." Most people wouldn't have stopped. Driving home, I kept thinking about that. About how, honestly, I almost didn't stop. I'd been so wrapped up in my own plans, so focused on getting home, that I almost missed the chance to do something meaningful for someone else. And that one sentence, most people wouldn't have stopped, started to feel less like something he said and more like a question he was asking. It's funny, for years after that, I found myself stopping for people more often. Like maybe it's because I just remember what it felt like to be on the side of that road with someone who actually took a second to care. I still wonder sometimes about that guy and his son, about how their camping trip turned out, and whether he still makes jerky that good. And I made a point to keep a gallon of water in my car just in case. So, here's a scene. I'm in the kitchen at 11:43 p.m., staring down at a piece of garlic toast I ordered from a late-night delivery app that I fully knew was a little outrageous. I mean, who orders a single piece of garlic bread at nearly midnight? But there I was in my pajamas, waiting by the door for that distinct, crinkly plastic sound of someone dropping off food. That moment made me stop for a second and think about the sheer absurdity of it all. Once upon a time, Garlic toast was something you toasted yourself, or maybe, at most, picked up alongside a meal. And here I am, casually dropping money on a small slice of bread with garlic and a sprinkle of cheese like it's the most normal thing in the world. But honestly, I couldn't stop smiling. The fact that I could even do this, that it was possible to scroll through dozens of options and finally settle on a lone piece of bread from an all-night diner. What a time to be alive, right? Then I started thinking about all these tiny conveniences and how much they've seeped into my daily life without me even realizing it. Take keeping up with friends. Most of my closest friendships are practically conducted through memes now. I don't know how it happened, but at some point, the meme became a language, a way of saying, "Hey, I saw this and thought of you," without actually calling or even texting any meaningful words. You send a funny cat or a screenshot of a relatable adulting joke, and boom, your friend knows exactly what kind of day you're having. It's comforting, somehow, like we've created this whole new way to talk without really talking. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's like we've agreed to these modern rituals without ever discussing them. Take texting, for example. K has become a message in itself. Simple, sometimes a little passive-aggressive, but effective. Or there's the classic LOL, which now usually signals that you're not laughing out loud at all, but rather acknowledging something amusing with the bare minimum of effort. It's like we're all living in this inside joke where certain words mean different things, and we're all in on it, no explanation needed. Then there's the whole online shopping thing. I can barely remember the last time I went into an actual store to buy something basic. I needed shampoo last week, and instead of running down to the nearest shop, I ordered it online while half watching a show, fully aware that it wouldn't arrive for 2 days. It's this odd mix of impatience and patience we've developed, where we want things instantly, but also don't want to expend any real energy to get them right now. Somehow, the act of simply clicking add to cart is satisfying enough. We've created a whole routine where actual shopping feels like a last resort, like something we do only when delivery isn't an option, which is almost never. And speaking of rituals, let's talk about the glorious rise of the group chat. Group chats have become their own little ecosystems where time feels a little strange. A message from a friend can sit unread for hours, and that's normal. You'll see a joke, maybe ignore it for a bit, then scroll back later to laugh. Somehow, there's no pressure, no rush to respond immediately. It's like we've redefined what it means to be in touch. There's a kind of intimacy in the way you can join in and exit a conversation on your own time, almost like a house party where you can dip in and out whenever you want, and no one really minds. Everyone's operating on their own timeline, and yet the chat keeps going, this endless stream of random thoughts, check-ins, and dumb gifs. Then there's the way we handle birthdays. Remember when celebrating someone's birthday meant a card, maybe a phone call? These days, if I remember someone's birthday, I'll shoot them a Facebook post, or if they're lucky, a funny text. And hilariously, that counts. A quick happy birthday and a couple of emojis. It's understood that we're all busy, we're all distracted, but hey, I remembered you existed on your special day, and somehow that's enough. It's funny how we've simplified these once special occasions into shorthand that still feels kind of genuine, like the gesture itself has evolved to match our collective attention spans. The other day, I realized I barely take pictures on an actual camera anymore. Every shot I take now goes straight to my phone's gallery, often ending up unposted in some cloud-based limbo where it will sit, forever unseen. In some strange way, the act of taking the photo, just capturing the moment, is enough. Half the time, I don't even revisit those photos. They're just there like little snapshots of life that I can scroll through, but often don't. It's almost like the point isn't to look back, but to know that you could if you wanted to. So much of modern life is like this, simple, small gestures that might seem a little ridiculous if you stop to think about them, but somehow feel totally normal because everyone's doing it. I find it funny, though, that the things we used to consider lazy or overly convenient are now just everyday habits. I mean, not so long ago, the idea of asking someone to deliver a single cup of coffee to my door would have sounded like something only a billionaire would do. But here I am, one of the many people willing to pay a little extra just to avoid the 5-minute drive. And here's the strange, sweet part. Somehow, all of these quirks, all these little habits, feel like they're bringing us together, even if it's in a quirky, roundabout way. I think about how I keep in touch with friends through 5-second video clips and random memes. And it makes me laugh that, Yeah, we're not really talking, but we're still connected. Maybe it's shallow or silly, but it's a way of saying, hey, I'm here, and I thought of you. And that counts for something. In a world that feels busier and more complicated than ever, maybe it's these little shortcuts and tiny conveniences that help us keep going. They're like invisible supports holding us up, letting us go through the motions while still keeping a toe in each other's lives. So sure, I may be paying someone to bring me garlic toast at midnight, or scrolling through the same 3 meme templates on repeat, but somehow, I feel oddly comforted by it all. It's funny how the smallest things, an emoji, a quick meme, a 2-day delivery, can make life feel a bit easier, even a little warmer. So, now I'm curious. What little thing in today's world makes you smile, even if it's a bit quirky? I'm not exactly what you'd call an animal person. Don't get me wrong, I don't dislike animals, but I'm not the kind of person who seeks out pets or watches dog videos for hours. So, when I woke up one morning, stretched, yawned, and saw a pigeon perched on my windowsill, staring at me with that unblinking pigeon intensity, I barely gave it a second thought. But then it spoke. No, really. It looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You're overdue for a life change, don't you think?" Now, at first I thought maybe I was still half asleep. Maybe my dream brain hadn't quite powered down yet. But the pigeon kept talking. I mean, come on, it continued. You keep saying you're bored, that you're stuck in a rut, but you don't do anything about it. It blinked, tilted its head, and added with a feathery shrug, "Just my 2 cents." I was too stunned to respond. A talking pigeon? Handing out life advice? Was I having some kind of early morning existential breakdown? But the pigeon simply gave me a knowing look, fluffed up its wings, and flew away as if it had said all it needed to. Still, I couldn't shake it off. That pigeon's words echoed in my mind as I got ready for the day, which was bizarre enough on its own. But then I noticed a neighborhood cat watching me from the sidewalk on my walk to work. As I passed, it lifted one paw, very poised like a feline therapist ready to drop some knowledge. "You know," it drawled, "it wouldn't kill you to set better boundaries. That friend of yours, what's her name? Sarah? She's a little much, don't you think?" "Wait, what?" I froze mid-step, looking at the cat in disbelief. It just sighed like it was tired of explaining the obvious. "You're a bit of a pushover. Maybe you should stop letting people walk all over you. Just a suggestion." With a lazy flick of its tail, it slinked away, leaving me standing there, feeling like I'd just been scolded by the ghost of Freud. At this point, I was convinced I was either going mad or had somehow tapped into a Dr. Dolittle-like ability to understand animals. Only, instead of chatting with me about where the best garbage cans were, these animals seemed to know a lot about my life and had no hesitation in telling me exactly where I was messing it up. On the way to work, a few more critters popped up. A scrappy-looking squirrel on a park bench warned me, "Maybe lay off the takeout for a while, yeah? Your wallet will thank you." And a tiny sparrow fluttered down to whisper, "Stop doom scrolling before bed. It's not helping your sleep." I was baffled. It was like all these animals were little self-help gurus, each with a different nugget of wisdom on how I could fix my life. By the time I got to the office, I was almost afraid of what would happen next. I was half expecting the office plants to start in on me, telling me to organize my inbox or something. But, thankfully, the day passed without any further life advice. Until lunchtime, that is. I just unwrapped my sandwich and was about to dig in when a crow landed on the bench next to me, cocking its head as it sized me up. "That job of yours," it cawed. "You're not really happy there, are you?" My sandwich hovered mid-bite. It's okay," I mumbled defensively, not sure why I felt the need to justify my life choices to a bird. The crow shook its head in disappointment. "Come on, you could do better. You just have to take a risk. What's the worst that could happen? You've got potential you're not using." Then, with a ruffled hop, it snatched a piece of my sandwich and flew off, leaving me with a lot to chew over, literally and metaphorically. I couldn't focus for the rest of the day. These animals, as strange as it sounds, were onto something. Every one of them had hit the nail on the head. I had been feeling restless, stuck, and maybe a little directionless. But to have a pigeon, a cat, a squirrel, a sparrow, and a crow all call me out on it, that was something else entirely. On the way home, I spotted a dog sitting calmly on a park bench, like it was waiting just for me. As I approached, it gave me this gentle, knowing look, and I knew it had something important to say. I sat next to it, feeling oddly nervous. The dog looked up at me with those big, soulful eyes, and in a deep, comforting voice it said, "You're way too hard on yourself. You don't have to figure everything out all at once, you know? Just keep moving forward, one step at a time. Give yourself a break." For some reason, that hit me harder than any of the other advice I'd received. The dog's words felt like a hug, and for the first time all day, I felt a little bit of peace. I thanked the dog, and it gave me a warm look before trotting off, tail wagging as if it had just done its good deed for the day. Over the next few days, the animals continued to pop up with their bits of wisdom. A fish at the pet store advised me to flow with the current once in a while instead of always swimming against it. A raccoon digging through my trash told me, "Not everything's as bad as it seems. Sometimes you find treasure in unexpected places." And even a butterfly, delicate and colorful, whispered as it landed on my shoulder, "Transformation is never easy, but it's worth it." Slowly but surely, I started taking their advice to heart. I started setting boundaries, taking more risks at work, letting go of some of the stress I put on myself. I even started cooking at home, much to the delight of the squirrel, who would occasionally chatter his approval from the tree outside my kitchen window. Every animal encounter became a sort of milestone. Each one showed up exactly when I needed it, dropping wisdom like little breadcrumbs, leading me toward a better version of myself. The funny thing was, I found myself genuinely looking forward to my next piece of animal advice, wondering what little insight they'd offer me next. And one morning, I woke up to find that the animals were gone. No pigeons on my windowsill, no chatty sparrows or squirrels. It was just a regular, quiet morning. Part of me missed them, but I realized that they'd given me everything I needed. The lessons, the encouragement, the reminders to take care of myself. I carried all of it with me, even in their absence. Now, whenever I see an animal, whether it's a pigeon pecking at crumbs, a stray cat crossing my path, or a crow cawing from a lamppost, I smile. Maybe they're watching, waiting for someone else who needs a little nudge. Or maybe, just maybe, they're still watching over me, silently cheering me on. Has anyone else ever imagined something as wild as this? Or am I the only one who's secretly hoping for a life coach pigeon? I hadn't planned on moving back into the old house, not even temporarily. It was just supposed to be a quick check-in, a week at most. My brother had been calling more frequently, his voice strained, hinting around the edges about how Mom was getting worse, but never saying exactly how. In the end, it wasn't his words, but the silence that made me pack a bag and get in the car. When I pulled up to the house, it looked the same, too much the same. The paint had started to peel, the front steps sagged a little, but there it was, standing stubbornly against time, as if nothing had changed. Only everything had changed. Mom was sitting on the couch, a blanket draped over her knees, her frame smaller and frilier than I remembered. Her hands shook slightly as she held a cup of tea, looking up at me with a half-smile that tried to pretend she wasn't as fragile as she looked. "Well, there you are," she said, her voice a little thinner but still carrying that same old tone, the one that always made me feel like a kid again, despite everything. "Here I am," I replied, smiling back, even though there was a weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. I went over to her, awkwardly hugged her, feeling the bones in her shoulders sharper than they should be. She pulled back with that same half-smile, brushing my hair back like she used to, her hands still shaking a little. That first week was a blur of quiet days, grocery runs, and watching her sift through old photo albums on the couch, her eyes lingering on faces and moments she'd forgotten but didn't want to lose. She pointed a photo sometimes and asked me about a name or a story. Most of the time, I didn't have the answers, but I'd fill in the blanks, making up little tales when the truth had faded. One evening, she looked up from a picture of my dad, holding it close, her brow furrowed like she was trying to piece together fragments of memories. "You know, your dad used to love these long drives," she said softly, her eyes not really seeing me but somewhere far away. "Every Sunday, he'd pack us into the car, no destination in mind, just us and the open road. Remember?" I did, but it felt like remembering something from a dream. I hadn't been back in years. Hadn't wanted to be. Somehow, the idea of home had started to feel more like an obligation than a place of comfort. Maybe I was running from that expectation. Or maybe I just needed the space to grow into whoever I thought I was meant to be. A few days later, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees, Mom asked, "Have you been up to the attic yet?" "No." "Why?" I asked, curious but hesitant. The attic had always been a place I avoided. It was crammed with boxes full of old clothes, toys, papers, memories. The last time I'd set foot up there, I'd barely managed to stay 5 minutes, overwhelmed by the dusty smell of the past, the weight of things left behind. "I thought you might want to," she said, her gaze distant. "There's something up there I kept for you. Thought you'd want it when the time came." I didn't ask what it was, just nodded, the weight of her words sitting heavily in the air between us. That night, while she slept, I climbed the narrow, creaky stairs up to the attic, feeling like a trespasser in my own memories. The attic was thick with dust and shadows, everything draped in the soft glow of a single overhead light. I scanned the boxes, half-forgotten Christmas ornaments, old clothes, a set of dishes I vaguely remembered from childhood. And then, near the back, I saw it, a leather-bound notebook, tucked away in a box that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I flipped it open, and the pages were filled with my mother's handwriting, each line an entry, a glimpse into her life from years ago. Most of them were short, little musings about the day, notes about what my brother and I had done, things she thought of but never said out loud. As I read through the pages, I felt something strange, like I was meeting her for the first time. Not as my mother, but as someone with dreams, regrets, moments of joy, and quiet pain. One entry in particular caught my eye. She'd written it just after Dad died. "I never thought I'd be alone this way." It read, "But maybe we're all a little alone, even when we're together. The kids don't know, of course. They see me as their mother, but they'll never see me as a person. Not really. And that's fine. They're not supposed to." I closed the notebook, feeling a tightness in my chest, a mixture of guilt and grief I couldn't quite put words to. I went back downstairs, but I couldn't sleep that night. Her words echoed in my mind, filling the empty spaces, making me feel like I'd missed something, some part of her that had been there all along, but I'd never bothered to see. The next morning, I joined her at the kitchen table, pouring her tea and sitting across from her, watching the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the cup. I thought about saying something about the notebook, about how I wished I'd known her better, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we sat together in a comfortable silence, letting the morning light fill the kitchen. I don't know how long I stayed after that. The days blended together, each one a small piece of a life I'd almost forgotten. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watch the stars come out, sometimes talk, sometimes just sit in the quiet. I found myself settling into the rhythm of it, of being there, of not rushing off to somewhere else. One night, as we were sitting in the dim glow of the porch light, she reached over and took my hand, holding it with a surprising strength. "Thank you," she said softly, looking out at the darkened trees. "For staying." I didn't know what to say. I just squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of years between us, of words left unsaid, of moments that would never come back. In the end, it wasn't some grand gesture or a dramatic farewell. Just a quiet morning, a lingering goodbye at the door. She gave me a small, sad smile, a wave that felt more final than I wanted to admit. As I drove away, the notebook was in the passenger seat, a silent reminder of everything I'd learned and everything I'd missed. So, this happened the other morning when I was running late for work. I dashed into a coffee shop I'd never been to before, trying to get my caffeine fix as fast as possible. While waiting for my coffee, I glanced at the pastry case. And there it was, tucked in among the muffins and scones, a jelly-filled powdered donut. But not just any jelly donut. This thing had that deep red, sugary filling, practically bursting through the edges, and that soft coating of powdered sugar that somehow always managed to get everywhere. Before I knew it, I was transported back to Saturday mornings in my childhood, sitting at my grandparents' kitchen table, a donut exactly like that in front of me, and a glass of milk set out by my grandpa, who would sneak me treats whenever my parents weren't looking. Those mornings had this timeless, magical feel to them. The kind of morning where everything slowed down, no rush, no distractions, just me and my grandpa, who always seemed to have all the time in the world. Every Saturday was the same. I'd stay over at my grandparents' house, and the next morning, I'd wake up to the smell of fresh coffee and hear my grandpa humming old songs in the kitchen. He'd give me that big smile, eyebrows raised as if he had a special surprise in store, and ask if I was ready for a real breakfast. Then he'd pull out one of those powdered jelly donuts, always looking around the room in mock secrecy, like we were breaking some major rule by eating dessert for breakfast. And of course, I couldn't take a single bite without that powdered sugar ending up all over my face, my hands, even my clothes. I'd end up laughing, and he'd pretend to be shocked, handing me a napkin like he hadn't fully expected it. My grandpa would join in, taking his own donut and inevitably getting powdered sugar in his mustache. He'd pretend to be oblivious as my grandma would walk in, take one look at us, and shake her head with this little smile as if to say, "You too are incorrigible." Standing there in the coffee shop, staring at that donut, I could practically feel the warmth of their kitchen, see the early morning sunlight streaming through the windows, hear the faint sound of their ancient radio crackling out some old jazz tune. It's funny how something as small as a donut can be a portal straight back to a place in your life you didn't even realize you'd been missing. I realized that those mornings weren't just about the food. They were about this feeling of complete safety and belonging. Just me and my grandpa sharing an inside joke, both of us grinning like we were getting away with something big. After a moment of standing there lost in thought, I snapped out of it, feeling a little silly, but I knew I had to buy that donut. I didn't care if I was late for work or if I got powdered sugar all over my work clothes. When I took that first bite, the sweetness was exactly as I remembered. Maybe even sweeter since I knew what it meant now. With each bite, I could feel a little of that childhood magic. The freedom, the innocence, that unbreakable bond one had with my grandpa, who always seemed larger than life, like he'd be around forever. It got me thinking about how we rush around so much as adults, always worried about the next thing, the next meeting, the next deadline. We lose track of those little rituals, those tiny moments that make life feel big. For me, it was a donut on a Saturday morning, powdered sugar everywhere, and a grandfather who looked at me like I was the best part of his week. And even though he's not around anymore, for those few minutes, I had him back with me. I walked out of that coffee shop with a grin on my face, powdered sugar and all. I know it sounds silly, but it felt like I'd been given this quiet, unexpected gift. A reminder that the little things, the ones we think are forgettable, are sometimes the ones that stay with us the longest. So, I'm curious. Has anything small and simple ever brought back a whole world of memories you didn't even know were waiting? I remember exactly how I felt that first time I got ghosted by a company. I'd nailed every part of the interview process, right down to the final handshake where they assured me, with that overly enthusiastic recruiter smile, that I'd hear from them in a few days. I walked out of their office already planning my first day, already rehearsing how I'd quit my current job with the most satisfying line I could think of. I was that sure. A few days passed, then a week, then two. My friends told me to keep following up, to stay on their radar, as if I had already been orbiting their emails like some forlorn comet, sending polite messages with a vague hope that they'd respond this time. They didn't. I never heard a word. It stung, but I chalked it up to bad luck. Maybe I was just the almost hire, the silver medalist in their candidate pool. Then it happened again at the next job, and the next. It was like this ghosting epidemic had taken over the whole corporate world, as if the hiring process now came with some new unspoken rule. We only reach out if you're hired. Otherwise, just read between the lines. By the time I hit my fifth or sixth silent rejection, I was tired of reading between the lines. I wanted to storm their office and demand answers. But, of course, I didn't. Who would even listen? The worst one was when a high-end tech company put me through 6 interviews over 3 weeks, squeezing every ounce of experience out of me like they were milking a confession. They had me in with every team member, every department head. I presented slide decks, solved hypothetical crises, did mock calls with clients. They sent me endless thank you for your time emails, complete with reminders of how close I was. I was under their spotlight, answering questions about every career choice I'd ever made. By the end, I'd practically forgotten what the role was. I was just a performer on their stage, playing whatever role they wanted me to, hoping they'd finally say I'd gotten the part. The last round was with the company VP, a guy who looked at me like I was some artifact they were examining, not a person. After nearly an hour of his scrutinizing gaze, he leaned back, looked at me with a smile that seemed more like a smirk, and said, "I think you're going to fit in great here." I left that office on a high that I can't even put into words. I went out to dinner that night, celebrated with friends. They'd practically promised me the job. I waited for the email that night. It didn't come. I waited the next day, checked my phone obsessively, half laughing at myself for being so anxious. Another day passed, and another. When a week went by, I caved and sent a follow-up email. I got a curt response saying the decision was still pending. That's it. No apology for the delay. No hint of reassurance. I told myself they were just taking their time. I kept waiting. Another week slipped by, and I finally called them. No answer. My calls went to voicemail, my emails went unanswered, and it felt like the world had been sucked into this bizarre vortex where I didn't even exist. I couldn't believe it. They put me through a hiring boot camp and left me hanging as if I'd imagined the whole thing. Part of me wondered if they'd lost my file, but the rational part knew the truth. They'd moved on. I was just another applicant they'd discarded the second they were no longer interested. It was humiliating, frustrating, but above all, it made me furious. Furious at a system where companies have so much power that they don't even feel the need to acknowledge your existence when they're done with you. So I started reading about the hiring industry, trying to figure out if this was just my bad luck or if it was something deeper. Turns out, it's a dirty little secret in the industry. Pipeline management, they call it. Companies fill their pipeline with potential hires, drawing them in for rounds and rounds of interviews to gauge interest, assess talent pools, even benchmark their current employees' skills. They aren't always hiring for the role right away. They're just testing the waters, window shopping. And for the people who don't make the final cut, they're just casualties of the process, discarded without a word. It all made sense now. These companies could ghost candidates because they knew they could get away with it. They were gambling with people's time and energy, using interviewees like test subjects, and when they were finished, they simply vanished. No consequences. It was like discovering the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, pulling levers and pretending there was some grand method when really, it was all smoke and mirrors. I realized the whole hiring game was stacked in their favor, a kind of twisted power dynamic where they held all the cards, and we just hoped they'd play nice. If I could write a law, it'd be simple. Once you've interviewed a candidate, you owe them a response. End of story. If you ghost someone after multiple rounds, you'd face a fine. For every day that went by without closure, you'd owe compensation, $1 a day at first, increasing with each week of silence. Imagine that. They'd be scrambling to write rejection emails within hours, maybe even call with actual feedback for once. The beauty of it is, it would force companies to stop viewing candidates as disposable. They'd have to start treating applicants like people again, people whose time has value. I even drafted my dream legislation in my head, the Candidate Respect Act. It'd come with penalties for ghosting, accountability clauses, and even an option for candidates to file complaints. And if a company repeatedly ghosted people, they'd lose access to major job boards, forced to pay for their sins in PR backlash and lost credibility. Maybe it's a fantasy, but imagine the shift it'd create. Suddenly, candidates wouldn't be ghosted after 5 interviews. We wouldn't be left hanging in some job-hunting purgatory, obsessing over inbox notifications and wondering if our time was worth anything to them. One night, a friend and I were talking about our ghosting stories, each of us trying to outdo the other with horror tales. She told me about a company that made her do an entire project proposal just to drop her with no warning. Another friend had gone through 10 interviews, only to be ghosted after the last one. It was like we were sharing battle scars, laughing at the absurdity, but there was a sense of exhaustion behind it all. It wasn't just disappointing anymore, it was dehumanizing. Recently, I stumbled on a LinkedIn post from that same company. They were boasting about their open hiring practices and commitment to treating candidates with respect. I stared at it for a long time, thinking about everything I'd been through with them. I wanted to comment, to call them out, to let the world know what their respect actually looked like. But I didn't. I knew it wouldn't make a difference. It'd just be buried under other comments. They'd probably never even see it. But that's the thing. They've got this whole system rigged where they get to set the terms and we're just expected to play along. And sure, I might be bitter, but I'm also determined. Next time, I won't be putting up with it. I'll read the signs early, the vague reassurances, the dodged questions, that we'll get back to you soon. That means absolutely nothing. And maybe, if enough people start expecting better, start holding companies accountable, things will shift. But until then, I'm holding on to my vision of the Candidate Respect Act, of a world where we can expect more than silence after all our effort, of a system that's fair to us too. And who knows, maybe someday, someone with real power will see this problem for what it is and decide it's time to even the playing field. It started with the kind of message you don't expect to get from someone you barely know, a message that hinted at a kind of openness, a willingness to skip the small talk and dive straight into the real stuff. "Hey," she wrote, "what's the most unexpected thing you've done for love?" It caught me off guard. Most people start with, "How's your day?" or "Seen any good movies lately?" But this question had a weight to it, a risk. So I told her. I told her about the time I'd driven 6 hours through a snowstorm to surprise an ex on her birthday, only to find out she had forgotten to mention she was now seeing someone else. I wasn't even sure why I told her that, but it felt right, like she wouldn't judge. That was how it began with Eva. She had this way of making you feel like she wanted to know everything, like each story was a clue to some mystery she was trying to solve. I found myself sharing things I hadn't thought about in years. My failed attempts at playing guitar, my obsession with midnight drives, even my childhood dreams of being an astronaut. Her replies were always thoughtful, laced with humor and insight, and before I knew it, our messages turned into late-night phone calls, then video chats that lasted until dawn. When we finally met in person, it felt surreal, like walking into a memory. She was there at the cafe, tapping her fingers on the table, looking exactly like her pictures, but somehow more vivid, more real. I sat down, and she looked at me with this intense gaze, like she was seeing right through me. "You're late," she teased, even though I wasn't. We spent hours talking, laughing, sharing stories over coffee that went cold. She had this laugh that was contagious, that made you feel like you were the funniest person in the world. She was curious about everything, asking about books, dreams, things I'd long forgotten. After that, we were inseparable. She'd send me these random texts throughout the day, things like, "Guess what color socks I'm wearing?" or "What's the weirdest food combo you've ever tried?" I'd laugh every time, amused by her randomness, her ability to make even the smallest things feel like adventures. We'd spend weekends together exploring hidden spots in the city, finding old bookstores, trying street food, or just sitting on her rooftop, watching the skyline while she shared wild stories about her travels, her love for thrift shopping, her dream of one day opening a little bakery by the sea. It wasn't long before I realized I was falling for her. Hard. And it felt mutual, like we were both standing at the edge, ready to jump. One night, as we lay on her couch, she looked over at me, her face lit only by the flickering TV. She reached over, took my hand, and simply said, "Promise you won't go anywhere." I squeezed her hand, feeling this rush of warmth, and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." For a while it was perfect. The kind of perfect where you start imagining a future, a life filled with lazy Sunday mornings and spontaneous road trips. I met her friends, she met mine, and it felt like we were building something real. She'd come over to my place, cooking us pasta at midnight, making me laugh with her terrible accents, or just lying next to me, her head on my shoulder, both of us content in the quiet. Every moment with her felt like a gift, like I'd stumbled onto something rare and fragile. Then one day, she stopped responding. At first, it was just a few hours, then a whole night. I tried not to panic, told myself she was busy, maybe just needed space. But the silence stretched on, like a shadow creeping over something beautiful. I sent her a message, something casual, asking if everything was okay. Nothing. I tried calling, and it went straight to voicemail. My heart sank, this cold dread spreading through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that maybe I'd done something to scare her off, though I couldn't think of what. A few days later, she finally replied. Her message was short, almost clinical, saying she'd been thinking and wasn't sure she was ready for something serious. She said it wasn't me, that I was great, but she needed to figure herself out. I read her words over and over, feeling the floor fall out from under me. This was the same person who'd asked me to promise not to go anywhere, who'd looked at me like I was the one she'd been searching for. I tried calling her, desperate for an explanation, for anything that would make sense of it, but she didn't answer. For weeks, I held on to the hope that she'd change her mind, that maybe she was just scared and needed time. I kept thinking about all the moments we'd shared, wondering if they had meant anything to her, if any of it had been real. I replayed her laugh, her smile, the way she'd look at me like I was the only person in the room. But she was gone, like a mirage fading into the desert. Months later, I was out with friends, trying to move on, when I saw her across the room at a party. She was laughing, her arm around some guy, looking happy, carefree. My stomach twisted, a mix of anger and sadness clawing at me. She noticed me, gave a small, awkward wave, then turned away, her laughter carrying over the music like nothing had happened. I walked out, feeling the weight of all those memories, those promises, pressing down on me. It was like realizing the book you'd been reading was missing the last few pages, and you'd never get to know how it ended. I stopped dating after that. Not because I didn't want to, but because something in me had shifted like a door had quietly closed. I couldn't bring myself to believe in the words people said, in the smiles and laughs and shared dreams. Every time someone showed interest, I'd feel that pang of doubt, the memory of Eva like a bruise that hadn't healed. I kept wondering if love was just a trick, a temporary illusion that left you hollow once it faded. Some nights, I still think about her, about that promise she made me give, the one she'd broken without a second thought. I wonder if she thinks about me, if she ever remembers those long conversations, the rooftop nights, the laughter that once felt so effortless. But mostly I try not to wonder. I try to forget, to let go of the story we'd started and never finished. In senior year, there was a new kid named Leo who transferred to our school right after winter break. He had this vibe about him. Messy hair, leather jacket. I was like he'd seen a few things, you know? Not the kind of person who fit in with our quiet, suburban school. Everyone wanted to know his story, but he didn't talk much, just smirked whenever anyone asked about his past. Rumors swirled that he'd been expelled from his last school for pulling some wild stunt, but he'd never confirm or deny anything. He just leaned back in his chair with this slight grin, letting people wonder. Then came the day everything turned sideways. It was supposed to be an ordinary Wednesday, the dead of winter, gray and freezing. I'd stayed late after school for track practice, and by the time I left, the place was almost empty except for a few teachers and a couple of students loitering around the parking lot. As I was leaving, I noticed Leo standing by the entrance, looking around like he was waiting for something or someone. I was about to call out to him, but before I could, he turned and slipped back into the building. Curiosity got the better of me, so I went back inside. I followed him, quiet as I could, and watched as he ducked into a side door I didn't even know was there. I waited a minute, then followed him down the narrow staircase, the kind of stairs that look like they lead to a janitor's closet. But it didn't open into a closet. It opened into some kind of maintenance tunnel that seemed to run under the whole school. I kept my distance as he walked through the tunnel, watching him disappear around a corner. But then I heard voices, other voices, and footsteps echoing down the corridor. Leo was meeting someone down there. I stayed out of sight, but I could make out enough to understand that Leo was talking to some older guy who looked like he didn't belong anywhere near his school. He was dressed in dark clothes and had a harsh, weathered face. They exchanged a few words, too quiet for me to catch, and then I heard a metallic clank. It was the kind of sound that makes you tense up instinctively, like something you're not supposed to hear. Then they both laughed, Leo's low, easygoing laugh mixing with the man's rough, almost menacing chuckle. They shook hands, and I saw the man hand Leo something small and shiny. Leo tucked it into his pocket and turned, walking back the way he'd come. I barely had time to duck out of the corridor before he passed by, heading up the stairs like he hadn't a care in the world. I didn't even know how long I'd been holding my breath until he was out of sight. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. What was Leo doing down there? And who was that guy? My mind went wild with theories. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that he was somehow tied up in something serious, something dangerous. The next morning, Leo wasn't at school. People started whispering that he'd gotten into some kind of trouble, but no one knew for sure. Teachers were on edge, and you could feel it, the tension thick in the air. By lunchtime, people were saying they'd seen police cars parked outside his house. But when school let out, Leo strolled right back in as if nothing happened. I wanted to ask him about it, but he shot me this look, one that said, "Don't even think about it." So I stayed quiet. The next few days were oddly calm, like the quiet after a storm. And then out of nowhere, things got weird. Notes started showing up in people's lockers. Anonymous, typed-out messages printed on thick, expensive-looking paper. At first, people thought it was a prank, but each note seemed to contain something personal, something no one should know. A jock found a note warning him about his secret stash of alcohol in the locker room. One girl got a note about a relationship she thought was private. And then in my locker, I found a note that simply read, "Meet me in the tunnel tonight at midnight." Alone. I didn't know if I should go, but my curiosity was too strong to ignore. That night, I snuck out, drove to the school, and parked far enough away to avoid being noticed. I crept to the door and slipped inside, the whole building dark and quiet. The tunnel entrance was just as I remembered, and the stairs seemed to stretch longer than they had before, each step echoing louder than the last. When I reached the bottom, there he was, Leo, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, waiting like he'd known I'd show up all along. He didn't waste any time with small talk. "I know what you saw," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. He gestured for me to follow him further into the tunnel. I was too shocked to argue, so I just followed. We walked deeper into the maze of tunnels, twisting and turning, until I was completely disoriented. Finally, he stopped in front of a thick metal door. With a key I didn't see him take out, he unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was like something out of a spy movie. Maps of the school and surrounding areas covered the walls, along with photos of various students and teachers, names scrawled underneath them. There were stacks of files, some with official-looking seals, and a laptop humming quietly on a makeshift desk. Leo motioned for me to sit, and he leaned in close, his voice intense and urgent. "This school? It's not what it seems," he began, his eyes searching mine to see if I was following. "There's a reason I transferred here. I'm part of something, a group, if you want to call it that. We're here to uncover things they've hidden for years. The people who run this place, they're involved in stuff no one would believe." He explained in bits and pieces that the school was part of some experiment, something to do with observing students under extreme, hidden conditions. Apparently, that man I saw him with, he was an informant, someone who leaked information to his group. The notes? Leo had left them as a warning, trying to smoke out whoever was watching us. I sat there, my heart pounding, feeling like I was in way over my head. He kept talking, revealing pieces of a twisted story, one that involved surveillance, hidden cameras, psychological testing, things that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Just as he was finishing, he looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look so sure of himself. He leaned in closer, whispering one final warning. "Don't tell anyone about this. If they know you know, you're a target." I left that night shaken to my core. The next morning, Leo was gone. His locker was cleaned out, like he'd never been there. People shrugged it off as another one of his mysteries, but I knew better. I never found another note in my locker, and I never heard from him again. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of someone at the edge of the parking lot, just watching, and I'd feel that familiar chill. To this day, I don't know if what Leo told me was real or just some elaborate story. But every time I think about that room full of secrets, I wonder how much I really saw, and if maybe somewhere out there he's still watching. I knew something was up the second I opened my eyes and saw my alarm clock. It wasn't beeping, buzzing, or flashing red numbers in that "you're late" way. Nope, it was sitting there politely, as though it were waiting for me to make the first move. When I finally reached out to turn it off, it cleared its throat, not literally, I hope, and displayed a message. Good morning. Do you want 5 more minutes, or shall we begin? I stared at it, trying to comprehend how my alarm clock had developed both manners and a menu screen. 5 more minutes, please, I whispered back, half expecting it to laugh at me. But no, it flashed a cheerful, enjoy your rest, before promptly dimming itself to a cozy shade of warm pink, practically tucking me back in. I lay there, half amused, half bewildered, and thought, all right, let's just see where this goes. When I finally got up, everything in my room had taken on a kind of personality, as if it had been storing up quirks and secrets just waiting for me to notice. The lamp by my bed gave a sympathetic flicker as I stretched, and when I looked down, I swear my slippers looked pleased. I was barely awake, and they'd already scooted themselves closer to the bed, toes pointing up like they were saying, no rush, take it easy, we're right here for you. I slipped my feet into them, and I could have sworn they gave a tiny sigh of contentment. Downstairs, the kettle was whistling gently, like it knew exactly how I took my morning tea. The kitchen lights had dimmed just the way I liked for early mornings, and somehow, my favorite mug was already out on the counter. As I poured my tea, I noticed a little curl of steam spelling out a lazy hello before vanishing into the air. My cereal even seemed to plop into the bowl with extra pep, as if to say, today's going to be something special. I wasn't sure if I was being overly imaginative, or if my entire kitchen had really decided to throw me a surprise pep rally. But then I realized, why question it? If today was going to be quirky, I'd just roll with it. Stepping outside was like diving headfirst into an entirely new atmosphere. The trees on my street waved hello, not in the usual wind-swaying way, but with deliberate gestures, branches stretching in a kind of slow-motion ballet. A cat perched on a fence tipped its head, gave me a very knowing look, and even held up a paw in an oddly dignified greeting. I waved back because, well, why wouldn't I? On the sidewalk, I passed a man who looked at me like he knew exactly what I'd had for breakfast, which for some reason I found oddly comforting rather than creepy. It was as if we were all operating on the same wavelength now, tuned into the same pleasant channel. Every stranger I passed seemed to be offering silent good mornings with small nods and glances, like we all shared some little secret that made words unnecessary. At the bus stop, I encountered the usual morning crowd, except today, everyone was subtly tuned into each other. People exchanged amused glances as if they were silently sharing inside jokes. One elderly woman gave a little shrug to a guy in a business suit, and he grinned back as if to say, I get it, another day, right? The bench even had a kind of energy, a come-on-over friend vibe that made me feel like I was sitting down with a long-lost cousin instead of a cold metal seat. Then the bus pulled up, looking suspiciously aware. The doors didn't so much open as invite us in, like they'd been opened by a particularly gracious host. When I climbed on, the driver gave me a little nod, as if he already knew where I was headed. I murmured a thank you, to which he tipped his cap with the kind of understated charm you'd expect from someone in a black and white film. As I made my way down the aisle, each seat seemed to carry a different vibe. Some were clearly eager, practically buzzing, while others were subdued, ready for a quiet ride. Settling in, I glanced out the window, where the city had taken on a dreamlike quality, as if it were painted with softer lines. The buildings had a bit of a tilt, like they were leaning in to catch up on the latest news. I half expected one of them to wink. Streetlights gave off a friendly glow, not quite as harsh as usual, more like candlelight than fluorescent. I wondered if it would stay this way all day, or if reality would snap back to its usual aloof demeanor by lunchtime. As we rode through the city, I noticed the ads on the bus were, let's just say, a bit more interactive than usual. Normally, they'd show the same old rotating promotions, but today, they were talking back. A poster for toothpaste actually struck up a conversation, flashing words that seemed oddly relevant to my life. Smile a little brighter today, it suggested, and when I nodded, it continued, see? Isn't that nice? An ad for laundry detergent offered me extra fresh thoughts if I wanted them, and even though I had no idea what that meant, I felt vaguely refreshed just reading it. The people on the bus didn't seem fazed at all by the conversational ads. In fact, some were clearly joining in, trading nods and chuckles with the posters as if they were old friends. An older man 2 seats down gave a small wave to an ad featuring a dancing carrot. Don't ask me why a carrot. And the carrot actually bowed in response. By this point, I was beyond questioning anything. At my stop, I stepped off into a warm, golden morning that felt richer and deeper than any I could remember. The crosswalk lights didn't just flash walk, but offered an encouraging, take your time, it's a good day. I felt like I was being guided, like every signal, every little visual nudge was set up to ease me along with the flow. I looked over at a woman crossing the street beside me, and she gave me a grin that seemed to say, yeah, I know, just go with it. I grinned back, silently agreeing. My day carried on in a symphony of surreal little delights. The park fountains played a tune that sounded suspiciously like a lullaby. The coffee shop knew my order without me saying a word, even though I'd never been there before. The barista handed me my drink with a smile that said, this one's on the house, and sure enough, my receipt read, today's a gift. By the time I headed home, the world felt cozy, like I'd spent the day under the warmest, softest blanket. The streetlights flickered as I passed them, little good nights glowing gently in my direction. When I reached my door, I paused, taking in the world's strange embrace one last time. I murmured a quiet, thank you today, and felt the world settle around me with a contented sigh. As I closed the door, a final thought floated in, simple and wonderful. If tomorrow is just as strange, I wouldn't mind. So, if reality gave you a day to go with the flow, how would you So, this happened a few years back when I was fresh out of college, broke and feeling like I could take on anything. My grandma, who is the sweetest person you'll ever meet, calls me up one afternoon with what sounded like a pretty small issue. Honey, my dryer's not working right. Do you think you could come over and take a look at it? Now, let me clarify here. I have absolutely no training in appliance repair. Like none. My whole resume of handy skills at that point was basically just hanging picture frames and changing light bulbs. But I love my grandma, and I figured, hey, how hard could it be? Maybe it's just a clogged lint trap or something I can figure out with a YouTube video. So I drive over there, and she's thrilled. She makes me tea, feeds me like half a dozen cookies, and points me in the direction of the laundry room. I can feel the confidence building as I get down on my knees to inspect this machine that's older than I am. I fumble around for a bit and figure out that, yeah, the lint trap is a bit full, but that doesn't seem to be the whole problem. I start messing with a few knobs and buttons, trying to look like I know what I'm doing while silently praying I don't break anything. Grandma keeps popping her head in with a hopeful smile, saying things like, you're doing so great, sweetheart, which only makes me more determined not to fail. I'm thinking I got this, so I decide to dig a little deeper. I pull out my phone and search dryer won't start, common fixes. One of the suggestions is to check the heating element, so I figure, yeah, why not? At this point, I've got the entire dryer pulled away from the wall, and I'm just kind of looking at it, praying the solution will magically present itself. I spot a small panel in the back that I think I can unscrew to get to the heating element. I grab one of my grandpa's old screwdrivers from the garage, kneel down, and get to work. But as soon as I open the panel, there's this unsettling, heavy, burnt smell that hits me. I'd love to say my brain immediately went, hey, this is probably a good time to call a professional. But no, I was too far gone on the fix-it-myself train to turn back. So, I keep going, carefully tugging on wires and parts one probably shouldn't have been touching. Finally, I spot the heating element, this small coil of metal that looks like it's been charred a few times over. I think, this is the problem. Then, in what I can only describe as an act of complete ignorance, I decide to poke the coil with my screwdriver to see if it's loose. As I write this, I realize how incredibly dumb this sounds, but bear with me. The second my screwdriver makes contact, there's this massive spark, and the entire dryer jerks like it's been shocked back to life. I yelp, the lights flicker, and the next thing I know, a small wisp of smoke starts curling out from the back of the machine. At this point, my grandma comes rushing in, worried because she heard me yelp and sees smoke coming from the dryer. I'm trying to stay calm, but I can feel my heart pounding like crazy. She's asking if I'm okay, and I'm just standing there holding the screwdriver like it's the smoking gun. Grandma, I manage. I think we might need to call a professional. Now, bless her heart, she's still smiling, completely unfazed. Oh, honey, don't worry. Let me call Mr. Wilson from next door. He's always tinkering with things. He'll know what to do. I feel this mixture of relief and shame wash over me as she calls up Mr. Wilson, who's practically a local legend for fixing up old cars and lawnmowers. He pops over, takes one look at me, one look at the dryer, and just chuckles. After about 10 minutes of actual expertise, Mr. Wilson not only finds the root of the problem, something about a busted thermal fuse which I would never have found, but also gives me a kind, grandfatherly nudge on knowing your limits. He explains that some things just need a little professional know-how and that the DIY spirit is great, until you're on the brink of setting your grandma's house on fire. I sheepishly thank him, and he grins, telling me I can pay him back by mowing his lawn in the summer. I sit down with my grandma after all this, trying to laugh it off. She pats my hand, gives me another cookie, and says, "You were just trying to help, sweetie. That's what matters." And that's when it hits me. Sure, I might not have actually fixed the dryer, but she didn't care. The fact that I came over, that I tried to help, that's what mattered to her. Sometimes showing up is the real thing that counts, not the results. So yeah, I walked out of there with a mild electrical burn, a slightly bruised ego, and a story that still makes my family laugh. But I also learned that sometimes you have to be okay with letting others help you, and that it's all right to admit when you're out of your depth. Sometimes the best way to help is by calling in someone who knows what they're doing, even if it means swallowing a bit of pride. This story begins with what was supposed to be a perfectly ordinary road trip, a just get away for a day sort of thing. My friend Maya and I had planned to head out to this well-known hiking spot upstate, eat some packed sandwiches, take a few scenic pics, then drive back to be in bed by 11. But, of course, none of that happened. We set out mid-morning with zero expectations beyond seeing some nice trees and stretching our legs. Maya had her hiking playlist queued up, and I had an old-school map printed, mostly for fun, though we'd end up needing it later. A couple of hours into the drive, Maya saw a tiny hand-painted sign for a lavender festival pointing down a side road. She just looked at me, waggled her eyebrows, and said, "Come on, we're not that much in a hurry, right?" And honestly, who can resist a lavender festival in the middle of nowhere? So, we turned off the highway, headed down a winding, gravelly road, and found ourselves in a town so small it wasn't on our GPS. We figured the festival would be a few tents, maybe some lemonade. Instead, we drove into what looked like a fairy tale village. Wooden stalls covered with purple bunting, little booths with soaps and lotions, and whole buckets of lavender tied up with twine. The smell alone was worth the detour, just this calming, herby fragrance everywhere. A small band was playing folk music, and people were dancing right there in the grass. It felt like we'd wandered into a world that wasn't quite real. Maya and I spent the next hour sampling every lavender-themed treat we could find. Lavender lemonade? Check. Lavender ice cream? Check. Lavender popcorn? Surprisingly good. We chatted with the vendors, who were all impossibly friendly, like characters from a storybook who'd just been waiting for us to stumble upon their magical village. At one booth, an older lady sold us little flower crowns, which Maya insisted we wear because, as she put it, when else are we going to feel like woodland fairies? I didn't argue. It felt like the kind of day where anything could happen, and it was all totally okay. But here's where things got truly surreal. While we were meandering through the stalls, a kid, probably around 8, ran up to us, tugged on Maya's sleeve, and said, "You're it." She looked at me, confused, and then back at the kid, who had already bolted away, laughing. We quickly realized he wasn't alone. Around us, clusters of kids and some very enthusiastic adults were darting in and out of the booths, tagging each other and laughing. We'd walked straight into a village-wide game of tag. Maya just shrugged, grinned, and said, "Guess we're playing." What followed was a completely impromptu, absolutely chaotic game of hide-and-seek tag that spilled across the entire lavender field and into the neighboring apple orchard. We sprinted around like we were 10 years old again, dodging behind trees, stumbling over bushes, and laughing so hard my cheeks hurt. At one point, I hid behind a haystack only to find myself face-to-face with an elderly gentleman who whispered, "They'll never find you here," like we were in some covert operation. I laughed so hard I gave myself away instantly. After about an hour, the game finally fizzled out as the festival goers started gathering around a central fire pit, where someone announced that the legend was about to begin. Maya and I exchanged curious glances, shrugged, and sat down cross-legged in the grass with everyone else, still catching our breath. An older man, clearly a local with a flair for drama, stood up and began telling the story of the Lavender Witch. According to him, a friendly witch had once lived in the fields nearby, blessing the land so it would always bloom. As he spoke, the sun started setting, casting this golden-purple glow over the entire field. It felt like we were in on some old secret, like the town had pulled us into a place just slightly out of step with reality. By the time we got back to the car, the sky was a deep indigo, and the road was lined with little lanterns the locals had set up to guide people back to the main road. Maya turned to me, her eyes shining, and said, "Tell me this doesn't feel like a dream." I didn't need to answer. I knew exactly what she meant. We pulled out of the little town, our flower crowns still on, the car smelling like lavender from all our random purchases. But the day wasn't quite over. About an hour down the road, our car began to sputter, and we had to pull over on the side of a nearly empty stretch of highway. We tried calling for help, but we had no signal, of course. So there we were, flower crowns on, lavender-scented, stuck in the middle of nowhere. We were trying to laugh it off when a pickup truck pulled up beside us. The driver, a woman in her 50s with a cowboy hat and an accent thicker than molasses, rolled down her window and just said, "Well, ain't you two a sight?" She offered us a ride to the nearest town, and we squeezed into the front of her truck where a tiny dog sat on the passenger seat, eyeing us suspiciously. The woman told us her name was Ruby, and she'd been living in the area her whole life. As she drove, she shared the kind of local stories you don't hear anywhere else, about ghost sightings and treasure hidden in the hills. We finally got to a gas station with a mechanic who could fix the car. Ruby, who'd apparently decided we were her new friends, stayed with us the whole time, chatting with the mechanic and making sure we were set before she finally drove off, waving like she'd known us for years. By the time Maya and I made it back home, it was nearly 2 a.m., and we were deliriously tired, covered in dust, and still faintly smelling of lavender. The whole day felt like we'd stepped into some enchanted bubble, like we'd been transported into an adventure that was perfectly crafted to exist in its own magical little capsule of time. We never made it to the original hiking spot, but I wouldn't trade that day for anything. Sometimes I catch a whiff of lavender, and it takes me right back to the laughter, the games of tag, and the kindness of complete strangers on a highway. So, have you ever taken a detour that led to something magical? I hadn't planned on it, but one evening, just as the sun was setting, I found myself wandering down a narrow, winding road leading away from the city. It was one of those perfect autumn evenings, the air crisp and full of that earthy, smoky scent of falling leaves. The sky was this crazy palette of pinks and purples, like it was trying to outdo itself. I'd been restless all week, caught up in the noise of deadlines and commitments, and something in me was craving space, silence, and maybe a little magic. So, I kept walking. After a few miles, the streetlights thinned out, and it was just me, the road, and the quiet stretch of land on either side. Eventually, I spotted a small wooden sign. Harvest Moon Festival, tonight only. An arrow pointed down an old gravel road, winding through a darkened patch of forest. It sounded exactly like the kind of thing I needed, so I shrugged off any lingering hesitation and headed in that direction. The path opened up to a huge field surrounded by trees that seemed to hold their breath in the fading light. Little lanterns were strung up between the trees, flickering with warm, inviting light, and the whole place glowed with this quiet, almost enchanted energy. There were people milling about, couples holding hands, kids darting between stalls. It felt like I'd stumbled into another world, a world where time didn't matter, and the only rule was to let go and enjoy. I wandered through the crowd, passing small tables selling everything from handmade candles and pottery to bundles of wildflowers. There was music, too, a live band set up on a makeshift wooden stage, playing a mix of folk and bluegrass. The music blended perfectly with the night, the notes drifting into the trees and back again, like the forest was listening. After a while, I found a small stall that was offering free cups of hot cider. The woman running it was older, with a kind face and a thick scarf wrapped around her neck. She handed me a steaming cup and smiled, nodding toward a nearby fire pit surrounded by people, each wrapped up in blankets or bundled in cozy jackets. I took her suggestion and found an empty spot on one of the logs around the fire. The warmth hit me immediately, and I wrapped my hands around the cup, feeling the heat seep through my fingers. People were sharing stories around the fire, strangers swapping tales as if they were old friends. One guy, a tall, bearded man with a thick accent, was recounting some wild adventure he'd had while backpacking through Norway, complete with encounters with reindeer and almost falling off a cliff. Beside him, a woman with a wild mane of curly hair told a story about accidentally ending up in an abandoned castle in France, swearing it was haunted by the friendly ghost of an old duchess who'd lived there. The stories blended with the crackle of the fire, and soon it felt like I'd known these people for years. After a while, an elderly man with a warm, weathered face and a thick wool hat began to tell a story that hushed everyone around the fire. He spoke about his younger days, about a journey he'd taken alone across the country with nothing but a backpack, a map, and a head full of dreams. He described sleeping under the stars, meeting people in every small town who'd shown him kindness, and learning to be at peace with solitude. There was something in his voice that resonated, a kind of wisdom you could only earn through years of living. When he finished, everyone fell silent for a moment, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I'd felt out of place for so long lately, caught between responsibilities and dreams, trying to balance ambition with a desire for something simpler. Listening to him, I realized that maybe there was beauty in the search itself, in letting yourself wander, even if you didn't know exactly where you were going. As the evening wore on, people slowly began to drift away, heading back down the path toward town. But I felt like I wasn't ready to leave just yet. The fire was dimming, but the sky was clear, and above, the stars seemed impossibly close, almost close enough to touch. It was then that I noticed someone still sitting across from me, a girl who looked about my age, wrapped in a colorful scarf and holding a sketchbook on her lap. She caught me looking and gave a small smile. "You came alone too?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, feeling strangely at ease. She told me her name was Harper and that she'd come out to the festival on a whim, hoping for a little inspiration for her art. She flipped through her sketchbook, showing me page after page of intricate drawings, scenes of forests and mountains, faces full of stories, each sketch somehow capturing the spirit of something elusive yet familiar. I could see she poured herself into each page, like she was searching for something too. We ended up talking for hours, sharing stories of places we'd been and places we still wanted to go. It was like we'd known each other forever, and at the same time, there was the thrill of connecting with a stranger in a way that felt so real. The night grew colder, but neither of us seemed to notice. Around us, the lanterns were beginning to flicker out one by one, but the quiet comfort between us held everything together, as if the universe had paused to make space just for that moment. Eventually, she glanced at her watch and sighed. "I guess it's getting late." I nodded, feeling a pang of reluctance. We stood there, watching the last of the lanterns die down, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of something that would slip away as soon as I left. But then she pulled out a scrap of paper, scribbled down her number, and handed it to me. "In case our paths cross again," she said with a grin. We walked back to town together in comfortable silence, the quiet of the night settling over us like a blanket. When we reached the edge of the road, she waved goodbye, disappearing into the shadows with a backward glance and a small smile. I stood there for a while, watching until I couldn't see her anymore, before heading back to the train station. On the ride home, I leaned my head against the window, watching the dark fields roll by, feeling the weight of the day settle over me in a way that felt both grounding and freeing. It was like something had opened up inside me, a reminder that there was more to life than the relentless push forward, that sometimes you have to let yourself wander, to let go of expectations, to sit with strangers by a fire and let their stories seep into you. I still think about that night sometimes, the warmth of the fire, the sound of the laughter and music echoing under the stars. I still have that scrap of paper, and every now and then I wonder what became of Harper, if she found the inspiration she was looking for. The memory of that night, with its easy connection and quiet magic, stays with me. A reminder that sometimes the best moments are the ones you don't plan for. Have you ever found yourself somewhere unexpected, feeling as if the world was quietly unfolding just for you, like a secret you didn't know you... Alright, I can't believe I'm putting this out there, but here we go. I have this bizarre little habit that I fall into every time I develop a crush. My best friends would roast me alive if they knew, so I keep it pretty under wraps, but here it is. I create these completely fake text conversations with my crush, between me and them. And yes, it's exactly as embarrassing as it sounds. Let me explain before you judge. It's not like I think they're really talking to me. I'm not that far gone, I think. It's more like a weird form of self-therapy, a safe place to practice things I want to say, or just see how I'd feel if I actually got to talk to them. It usually starts small, like I'll be texting a friend and suddenly wonder what it would be like to text my crush instead. I think, what would I say if I wanted to start a conversation? Would they even respond? And then, I don't know, I sort of let myself daydream by typing out what I imagine they'd say back. It's harmless, mostly, but the rabbit hole goes deep, my friends. I start with a simple, imaginary text like, "Hey, I thought of you when I saw this, insert random meme." In real life, I'd probably never have the nerve to send it, but in my head, it's go time. I imagine how they'd respond, picture their little typing bubble popping up, and then I start typing out a response to their response. Before I know it, I've written out a whole fictional conversation, and I'm lying on my bed staring at my phone, grinning like a fool at my own writing. Ridiculous, right? It's like I'm scripting my own romantic comedy, complete with inside jokes, hilarious banter, and hypothetical Friday night plans. In these fake convos, they're always charming, always quick with the right comeback, and always just thinking of me too. Who doesn't want a little fantasy like that? And look, I know it's just my imagination filling in all the gaps, but somehow these texts feel weirdly real. For a brief moment, it's like I'm living in an alternate universe where I'm this brave, witty person who totally has it together. And before you ask, no, I don't actually send these. I'm not that far gone. But if you saw my Notes app, you'd find dozens of random snippets that read like half-finished conversations between me and, well, some person who has no clue I even have a crush on them. Sometimes I'll scroll back and laugh at my own texts, wondering who this confident person is who just told a real person that she's thinking about him. I have yet to actually pull that off in real life. Once, though, I got dangerously close to sending one. I had a major crush on a guy named Jake, this friend of a friend who I only saw at big group hangouts. He had this easygoing, friendly vibe that made me feel comfortable and completely panicked at the same time. One night after a group movie, we all went out for drinks, and Jake and I ended up in one of those accidental one-on-one conversations. We talked about everything: work, music, movies, even childhood memories. And I went home feeling like the universe had handed me the perfect connection. Naturally, I stayed up late that night, replaying every moment. And then I did what I do best. I started a fake conversation in my notes. It started with a "had fun tonight" smiling face with smiling eyes text, sent from me, of course. And in my head, Jake replied with a "same here, we should hang out more." Soon I'd imagined a whole dialogue that escalated to us making vague plans to meet up the next weekend. Here's where things got dicey. I was rereading it the next morning while half awake, and I almost sent the first message by accident. Like my thumb was hovering over send before I remembered. Oh right, this was pretend. Heart attack level, maximum. I would have had to disappear from our entire friend group and change my name to avoid the awkward fallout. Lesson learned. Keep imaginary conversations far, far away from the Messages app. There's also this odd sort of comfort in the fake text because in my mind there's no way they can disappoint me. It's like they exist in a pure, ideal version of themselves. Someone who will always be interested in what I'm saying, laugh at my jokes, or even text me first. Real life? Not so much. I could count on one hand the number of times an actual crush has messaged me out of the blue. But in my imaginary text world, they're practically glued to their phones, waiting for my next message. Now, in all fairness, I sometimes use these fake texts to test the waters. Like, what would I actually say if he asked me about my weekend plans? Or how would I react if he sent me a goodnight text? It's a safe way to practice being charming without risking actual rejection. I get to be bold, flirty, whatever I want, and I don't have to worry about sounding awkward or saying something stupid. Plus, it's great practice for when I do actually get up the nerve to talk to them IRL, which, okay, I'm still working on. There's one part of me that's mildly terrified someone will somehow stumble across my Notes app and find out about my imaginary text conversations. I can only imagine the horror if a friend were to swipe through my phone and stumble upon literal transcripts of my fake conversations. I'm pretty sure I'd have to move to another country. And it's funny because despite all my conversations, I've never actually managed to date anyone I've texted in my head. I guess that's what makes this habit so harmless. It's all in my imagination. These people are like little crushes who live on as my ideal texting partners, and they never actually have to deal with the awkward, real-life version of me who takes 20 minutes to think of a single text response. So that's my confession. I run an imaginary texting hotline where my crushes are all eager, attentive conversationalists, and I get to live out my perfect rom-com banner scenes in my own head. It's probably the most embarrassing, endearing, and downright cringeworthy thing I do, and it's become my weird little dating ritual at this point. Now that I've shared way too much, I'm begging you. Someone else tell me you do something just as quirky, please? Any fellow romantic daydreamers out there? The other day, I was walking around my neighborhood, earbuds, and listening to a podcast about, well, I can't even remember what. Something about space travel or AI, or why we all feel like we're terrible at time management. And as I'm strolling along, nodding at familiar faces and passing strangers, it hits me. I am, at this very moment, connected to what is essentially the entire knowledge of humanity, accessible by a small rectangle in my pocket. The same rectangle that can order me a pizza or find me a dog walker. And I'm thinking, when did this become so normal? When did we collectively agree that having a device that holds all human knowledge is as casual as wearing a pair of socks? It's like, not that long ago, you'd have had to go to a library, check out a giant encyclopedia, and pray that it wasn't too outdated to give you accurate information. Now I can ask my phone why flamingos are pink, or how old Cher is, or even something ridiculous like, are sharks ticklish? And get an answer before I've even fully formulated the question. And that's not even the surprising part anymore. The real miracle is that no one's surprised. Take the way we shop now. I remember when shopping was this big event. An outing, you know? You'd go to the store, try on clothes, actually feel the fabrics, and there'd be this sense of occasion. Now, if I need a new shirt, I can browse 10 stores in 10 minutes, add a few to my cart, and it'll show up on my door the next day like magic. If I don't like it, I just shove it back in a box, slap on a label, and send it off, as if I'm some high-powered returning things to the void. And somehow, we all treat this like it's a completely mundane process. No one's pausing to think, hey, remember when getting new clothes meant going somewhere? Now we're just wandering around the house, checking our phones like, what's my mail status today? Or take communication. I've got this group chat with my family that's active pretty much 24/7. My dad's sending blurry photos of whatever he's cooking. My mom's sharing a random article about how to stay hydrated, and my sister's posting pictures of her cat, who seems to always look slightly annoyed. It's this constant stream of conversation, but half the time, I realize we haven't actually talked. Like, no real voices exchanged. We're all in touch constantly, and yet when we're finally all together, it's like, hey, how have you been? As if we don't already know the exact details of each other's lives in real-time updates. It's like we're close, but also not. Somehow, we've managed to create a world where connection is both immediate and oddly distant at the same time. Another classic, directions. I was at a party last month, and I ended up helping this lost guy find his way. Do you know where the street with the coffee shop is? He asked, and I automatically reached for my phone, pulled up the map, and found it for him in 5 seconds. And it struck me, we've become totally reliant on GPS to the point where directions is practically a dead skill. Can you imagine asking someone for directions, and they actually pull out a folded map? Or worse, sketch you a quick drawing on a napkin? And yet, there was a time when that was just normal. You'd pull over, ask for directions. Someone would point vaguely, and you'd say thanks and hope you didn't end up in another county. And speaking of dead skills, anyone remember memorizing phone numbers? As a kid, I could recite the numbers of my best friends, my cousins, even my local pizza place. Now, I barely know my own. It's like we've outsourced part of our own memory to the cloud. Everything we need to know is stored somewhere out there, and we're fine with it. I sometimes wonder if my phone died and I needed to call a friend, would I even know where to start? I'd be fumbling, thinking, they're on Instagram, maybe Twitter? Even just the concept of home feels different now. With remote work and Wi-Fi everywhere, home isn't so much a place as it is an option. I have friends who spend half their time working from cozy little coffee shops or public parks. One friend told me, home is wherever my laptop and coffee are. And I laughed, but then thought, wait, that's actually kind of true. We've untethered ourselves from specific locations so thoroughly that home is now a vibe more than a place. You could pop open your laptop and connect to your colleagues from a beach, a basement, a balcony, you name it. And as long as there's Wi-Fi, you're good. Then there's the matter of entertainment. We have entire worlds at our fingertips, thousands of shows, movies, and books, all available instantly. I remember when you'd have to wait a week, yes, a week, to watch the next episode of a TV show. Now, we get impatient if Netflix buffers for 5 seconds. What? Why isn't it playing? Is basically the new what's taking the pizza guy so long. Binge watching has become such a casual part of life that we forget there was once a time where if you missed your show, you just missed it. No rebin. No streaming it later. Just sheer disappointment until the rerun. One of the funniest things, though, is how casually we take advice from algorithms now. I'll be watching a random documentary on ancient Egypt, and next thing I know, Netflix is like, if you enjoyed that, you might like this obscure Australian cooking show. And it's weirdly accurate. Sometimes I think, is this platform peering into my soul? But we just go with it. Like, sure, Netflix, you know me better than I know myself. Let's watch that. I wonder what past generations would think of a machine that understands our preferences better than we do. But maybe the biggest one is just how fast we expect everything to be. Instant en instant delivery, instant streaming, instant food. And I get it, convenience is fantastic. I love that I can order dinner and have it arrive at my door with the click of a button. But sometimes I wonder if we've gotten too used to this. Like the other day, I ordered a coffee on an app and had to wait a whole 5 minutes to pick it up. And for a split second, I thought, wow, that's taking a while. 5 minutes for a custom-made coffee. I had to laugh at myself. The old me would have spent longer just waiting in line. And now I was genuinely impatient at the idea of waiting even a few minutes. The more I think about it, the more I realize that we're all just kind of winging it in this hyper-connected world, adapting as we go, treating the unbelievable as if it's no big deal. We've woven futuristic tech into every part of our daily lives and then shrugged like, well, yeah, of course. And there's something beautifully funny about that. So here's my question. What's a piece of modern life that seems absolutely surreal to you, but you've somehow just accepted it as normal? It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that sits unnoticed between the excitement of midweek and the anticipation of the weekend. I was visiting a small coastal town, just passing through really, and had decided to take a walk along the shore to stretch my legs before getting back on the road. The town was quaint, with pastel houses leaning in close to cobblestone streets, the whole place smelling of salt and seaweed. It was like stepping back in time or into one of those vintage postcards you find in dusty antique shops. The sky was overcast, casting a silvery glow over the ocean, and I almost missed it in the haze. A little book lying in the sand, partially covered by seafoam and shells. It looked old, with a fraying leather cover that had been worn down by countless fingers in salty air. A bit waterlogged, but not so much that it couldn't still be opened. I looked around, half expecting someone to come running after it. But the beach was empty except for a few seagulls, squawking and circling overhead. My curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up, brushing off sand and flakes of dried seaweed. The cover was blank, without a title or any markings, and when I opened it, the pages were covered in faded handwriting, the ink blurred in places as if it had been soaked 100 times. It wasn't English, looked more like French, maybe, though some of it seemed almost like poetry or pieces of songs written in a strange, lilting dialect I couldn't quite place. But on the third page, I found a sketch. It was detailed, almost lifelike, of a small seaside cafe with chairs set out along the beach, all under the shade of a crooked blue umbrella. In the background, I could see this town's recognizable little row of pastel houses and a lighthouse perched on a cliff's edge. It felt familiar in a way that was both unsettling and enchanting. Intrigued, I looked up from the book, scanning the shore, and that's when I saw it. Down the beach, just far enough that it was partially obscured by a rock formation, was a cafe. It was exactly as the drawing had shown, down to the tilted blue umbrella and the metal chairs that looked like they'd been collected from 100 different yard sales. The book still clutched in my hand, I wandered toward it, my feet sinking into the wet sand with each step. As I got closer, I realized the cafe looked a little abandoned. The paint on the sign was peeling, and the boards creaked beneath my feet as I stepped onto the deck. It felt like the kind of place that had once been lively, but now existed only in fragments of memories, echoing laughter that had long since faded. Still, there were tables set, and even cups and saucers neatly arranged as if someone might sit down at any moment. That's when I noticed someone sitting alone at one of the tables, an elderly woman with wild gray hair, wearing a long, faded red coat that looked like it had been around since the last century. She was sipping from a small teacup, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she hadn't noticed me at all. I cleared my throat, unsure if I should interrupt, but she looked up, her eyes bright with that spark people get when they recognize something or someone. "Well, you've found it," she said, as if she'd been expecting me all along. I fumbled with the book in my hand, holding it up as if it were some kind of explanation. "This was in the sand," I managed. I think it led me here." She chuckled, the sound soft but filled with a sort of musical mischief. "Ah yes, the book's funny like that. It finds people when it wants to. I left it there this morning, hoping it might catch the right set of hands." She eyed me carefully, as though I were a puzzle piece she'd been trying to find a place for. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but she was already waving me to sit. I took a seat across from her, the chair wobbling slightly as I settled into it. Up close, she seemed older than I'd thought, with wrinkles that looked like tiny maps etched onto her skin, each one leading to a different story. Her eyes were deep and full of a warmth that was hard to describe, as if she'd seen the world 1,000 times over and found it endlessly amusing. "Do you know this place?" I asked, gesturing around. "It feels strange, like it's here, but not here." "Oh, it's here all right," she replied, leaning back with a sigh. "But it's not always easy to find. People used to call it the Café des Eggers, the Café of the Lost, a place for travelers like you, who aren't always sure where they're going." She winked, taking another delicate sip from her cup. I felt an odd lump in my throat, but I'm not lost, I protested weakly, feeling defensive for reasons I couldn't quite name. "I was just passing through." She raised her eyebrows, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Are we all, dear? Just passing through? That's what makes this place special. People find it when they're most in need of a reminder." "A reminder of what?" I asked, feeling both baffled and strangely soothed by her words. She smiled, a mysterious little tilt of her lips. "Of where you've been and where you're going. It's easy to lose track, isn't it? In the rush and the noise. The Café des Eggers has a way of helping people find their way back to themselves." I looked down at the book again, flipping through the pages as if it might suddenly make sense. The sketches inside were beautiful, haunting, a collection of places, moments, people I didn't recognize but somehow felt connected to. There was one sketch of a little boy flying a kite, another of a woman dancing alone in a field, a lighthouse beam cutting through fog, and finally, a page with an empty beach, waves rolling up over smooth, dark stones. The drawings were simple but vivid, each one capturing a single moment frozen in time. And as I looked at them, I felt a strange tug, as if these scenes were part of my own story, waiting for me to remember. I looked up to ask her how she knew all this, how any of this was possible, but she was gone. The chair across from me was empty, her red coat draped across the back like she'd left it there just a moment ago. I blinked, feeling a chill as I realized that I was completely alone. The cafe was silent. No clinking of cups or scraping of chairs, just the distant sound of waves crashing on the shore. I tried to call out, but my voice was lost in the vast quiet. After a moment, I rose, picking up her coat out of instinct and draping it over my arm, feeling a strange urge to keep it safe. I looked back at the book, wondering if it would reveal anything more, but the pages were now blank, as if the sketches had disappeared, leaving only faint impressions behind. Confused but strangely peaceful, I left the cafe and wandered back down the beach, the red coat a comforting weight on my shoulder. I glanced back, hoping to catch one last glimpse of the cafe, but it was gone. The entire structure vanished as if it had never existed, replaced by the familiar stretch of sand and seaweed. I looked down at the coat in my arms and the empty book, feeling an odd sense of gratitude, though I couldn't explain why. To this day, I still have that coat, hanging by my front door. Its color is vibrant as if it were new. And every once in a while, I'll find a tiny piece of seaweed in the pocket, or a faint scent of salt water clinging to the fabric. And as for the book, every now and then, if I'm feeling lost or uncertain, I'll open it, hoping to catch a glimpse of those sketches again. So far, they've never returned, but there's a part of me that believes maybe someday they just might. Have you ever stumbled upon a place or a moment that felt like it was meant for you, even if only for a little while? We call it the sunset standstill. It started as a spontaneous thing, and now it's one of the most grounding parts of our lives. Every day, no matter what's going on, we stop what we're doing and watch the sunset together. I know it sounds overly romantic, like we're living in some sappy movie montage, but honestly, it's one of the most real and steadying routines we have. It all started one particularly chaotic evening, when everything that could go wrong did. It was one of those days where you feel like you're barely keeping up, like every little thing is piling on top of you. I'd had a long day at work, and I was feeling worn out in that way that makes every little inconvenience seem huge. I walked in the door to find dishes stacked in the sink, laundry half done, and the trash overflowing, and I just snapped. I threw my bag down, sighed dramatically, and started grumbling about everything that needed to be done. My partner was trying to help, but we both knew I was too tired to actually be reasonable. Then, right in the middle of my frustration, they took my hand, pulled me out the front door, and said, "Look." We stood there in the doorway, side by side, watching as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting everything in this unreal golden pink light. I could feel my anger melting away with the day, the colors calming me more effectively than any pep talk or apology ever could. I'll never forget the way they squeezed my hand and said, "Sometimes we just have to stop and let things be just for a minute." We didn't say much after that. We just watched the sunset in comfortable silence, letting the world go still around us. By the time we walked back inside, my frustration was gone. I felt lighter, like the sunset had taken my worries with it, at least for a little while. After that night, we decided to make it a thing, a ritual. We'd pause at sunset, no matter what else was going on, and just be. It sounds small, but that simple pause started to mean everything to us. Some days, it was the only time we really slowed down and took a breath, just the two of us. And in that stillness, even after the most hectic day, everything felt like it would be okay. We started finding spots around town where the sunset looked especially beautiful. Sometimes we'd drive out to the lake, park by the shore, and sit on the hood of the car with a thermos of tea. Other days, we'd just stand in the driveway or even watch from the living room window if it was too cold to go out. One day, we even got caught in a rainstorm, and instead of running inside, we laughed and stood there in the drizzle, watching the sun sink behind the clouds. We were soaked, but that might have been one of my favorite sunsets. There was something wild and free about it, like we'd let ourselves get lost in the moment together. As time went on, the sunset standstill became our unspoken check-in. We didn't need to talk about it, but we both knew that when the sun started setting, we'd pause, find each other, and share that little sliver of peace. Some evenings, we'd talk about our day, sharing little victories or venting about things that bothered us. Other times, we'd just stand there quietly, lost in our own thoughts, but together, grounding ourselves in the same moment. One night, during a particularly stressful month, I remember walking outside, feeling so weighed down I could barely stand it. Work had been a nightmare, and I was doubting myself in all the ways you do when life feels too heavy. But then I felt their hands slip into mine, steady and warm, and just like that, I felt less alone. We stood there, watching as the sun slipped below the horizon, and they didn't say anything, just gave my hand a little squeeze. It was like they knew exactly what I needed without me having to say a word. Sometimes we bring a little snack out with us, fruit or a couple of cookies, or even a slice of pie on special occasions. We'd sit there munching, making a mini picnic out of our sunset ritual. I can't explain why, but it became the kind of moment that made life feel fuller. Like those few minutes of simple togetherness were enough to wash away the noise of the rest of the day. There's one sunset I'll never forget. We'd had a hard conversation the night before about something weighing on both of us. One of those talks where you feel closer afterward, but also a bit raw. The next evening, we went out to watch the sunset like we always did, but this time, it was as if the whole world was more vibrant, more alive. The sky was this deep shade of orange, and for a few minutes, everything was bathed in this warm, surreal light. We didn't say anything, but as we watched, it felt like we were both silently agreeing. This is us. We're okay. Seasons changed, and the sun sets with them. In the winter, we'd bundle up in coats, standing with our arms wrapped around each other for warmth, our breaths clouding in the cold air as we watched the sun dip behind bare trees. In the summer, we'd sit barefoot in the grass, our feet brushing, leaning against each other in the warm twilight. It didn't matter if the day had been good or bad. We both knew that at the end of it, we'd have this little pocket of time that was ours and ours alone. Now, whenever I see the colors of a sunset, I'm reminded of all those small, shared moments of standing still, side by side, finding calm in each other. The sunset standstill has become a part of who we are, a reminder that we're in this together, no matter how busy or stressful life gets. It's our daily reset button, a promise to slow down, take a breath, and remember what matters most. I don't know what it is about memories of those little simple things that seem to feel warmer the older I get. It's funny, really, how random bits of the past will pop up in my mind, almost like they're gently waving at me, asking me to come sit and spend a minute with them. They're not huge events or anything dramatic, just these tiny snapshots of life that I can't help but drift back to. The kind of memories that feel like a mug of something warm, like curling up under a blanket and letting myself stay there for just a bit longer. One of my favorites is from these lazy, late summer evenings after dinner. I'd be out in the backyard barefoot, feeling the coolness of the grass, watching the sky turn that soft pink and purple just as the sun was setting. I'd have a jar in my hands, the lid barely screwed on, and I'd be trying to catch fireflies like they were little golden fairies flitting through the air. I remember the thrill of seeing one blink close by, running to it, and then that moment when the tiny light would glow softly in my jar. I'd just watch them, transfixed by that tiny flickering glow, feeling like I'd captured a piece of magic. My dad would come out eventually, laughing and reminding me to let them go, saying something about how they had places to be too. And I'd open the jar, watching them drift out one by one, like they were thanking me as they blinked back into the night. Or that one weekend tradition we had, the Saturday afternoon visit to the used bookstore in town. I remember the way it smelled when you walked in, this combination of old paper and wood and dust, with this underlying hint of vanilla from some candle that was always burning on the counter. The aisles were narrow, packed with towering shelves that felt like they could fall over any second, and I'd squeeze through, running my fingers along the spines of books that looked too heavy to lift. I'd usually find something cheap, some book with a faded cover and bent corners. But to me, it felt like discovering a hidden treasure. I'd carry my book to the counter, barely able to see over it, and the owner, this older guy with glasses that were always slightly askew, would stamp the inside cover with his little seal, like he was officially sending it off with me. It made every book feel special, like I was in on some little secret each time. Then there's this one memory that's so random, but makes me smile every time. Those car rides on rainy days when my mom would take me to the grocery store. I'd sit in the front seat, a huge deal for me at the time, and I'd press my forehead against the window, watching the raindrops streak across it, tracing each one as it slid down in slow, winding paths. My mom would put on this old playlist she'd made on a CD, some classic rock and folk songs that she loved, and we'd just listen to the music, tapping our fingers on the steering wheel, not really talking, just existing together. She'd sing along quietly, and even though I pretended to find it embarrassing back then, I secretly loved it. Every time I hear one of those songs now, it's like I'm back in that car, just a kid watching raindrops on a window, feeling the warmth of the heater and the soft hum of my mom's voice filling the space. Then there was the yearly ritual of decorating for the holidays. We didn't do anything fancy, just a small tree in the living room and a string of lights in the window. But we had this little wooden box with ornaments we'd pull out each year, and everyone had a story. My mom would tell me the stories as we hung each one. A fragile glass angel that had belonged to my grandma, a paper Santa I'd made in preschool that was barely hanging together, a tiny sleigh my dad had found in a random store one year. I'd listen to these stories, holding each ornament carefully like it was something precious, hanging them just so, making sure they were all on display. By the time we finished, the room would be glowing, warm, and filled with this quiet, magical feeling. It wasn't about the decorations, really. It was about sharing that moment, each little piece of our family history coming together on this small, crooked tree. And of course, there was the summer camping trip with my cousins. We'd pile into our old van, packed with tents, sleeping bags, and way too many snacks, and drive out to this campground by a lake that my family had been going to for years. I remember the feeling of staying up late, way past any reasonable bedtime, just sitting around the campfire with my cousins, roasting marshmallows and making up ridiculous stories. One night, we decided we'd play hide and seek in the dark. Probably not the best idea given the amount of trees and rocks, but we were unstoppable. I remember sprinting through the woods, trying not to trip over tree roots, hiding behind a huge rock, my heart racing as I watched my cousins search the darkness, getting closer and closer. There was this strange thrill of being out there, surrounded by the sounds of crickets and the distant crackle of the fire, feeling like the world had shrunk down to just us and the trees and the stars overhead. One winter, I remember waking up to my dad shaking me gently, telling me to come look outside. It was around 5 a.m., still pitch dark, but when I peeked out the window, everything was covered in this thick blanket of snow, untouched and glittering under the streetlights. He looked at me with this mischievous grin and whispered, "Let's go make the first footprints." We bundled up, slipped outside in the freezing dark, and ran through the yard, making tracks in the snow, trying to see who could leave the weirdest trails. I was freezing, breath coming out in clouds, but I didn't care. We made snow angels, drew giant letters with our feet, and laughed quietly so we wouldn't wake the neighbors. It was like we were the only two people in the world. That quiet, perfect kind of memory that doesn't need a single word to say everything. And then there's this one tiny memory that for some reason has stayed with me. It was just an ordinary day at school, nothing special, just a regular recess. I remember standing on the blacktop with my friends, looking up at the clouds, and one of them pointed out a cloud that looked like a giant dog. We all stared up, squinting, trying to see it, and for the next half hour, we just stood there making up shapes in the sky, each one getting wilder and sillier. A dinosaur, a dragon, a castle with a moat, a pirate ship. We must have looked ridiculous, heads tilted up to the sky, arguing over who had spotted the best shape, but we didn't care. It was just this pure, silly joy, the kind that doesn't need anything fancy, just a few kids and the endless possibilities in the clouds above. All these little moments, they're like little fires that keep me warm when I think about them. They're not the big events or milestones, just small, quiet pieces of life that somehow feel bigger than anything. Each memory a tiny reminder of a world that felt both safe and vast, where time moved slower and everything seemed a bit more magical. So, what random memory from the past brings you that instant, warm feeling when you think? It was supposed to be the most ordinary of Saturdays. I'd woken up with a single goal: get groceries, maybe find a new book to read, and then do a marathon session of my favorite TV show. But life apparently had other plans. It all began in the grocery store parking lot. I was just about to grab a cart when I noticed a wallet on the ground. Picking it up, I saw an ID peeking out from the side pocket. An old-fashioned black and white photo of a man in his 60s with a mustache that looked like it had lived through several style trends. The name on the ID was Louis J. Rivera. I took the wallet to customer service, but as I walked away, something kept tugging at me to go back. I don't know what made me do it, but I ended up opening the wallet again, standing there by the service counter. There, tucked inside, was a little handwritten note that read, "If you found this, you're meant to. 1170 Willow Street. Look for the red door." I stared at it for a good 30 seconds, waiting for a logical explanation to surface. But nothing made sense. And somehow, that was all the encouragement I needed. Before I could rethink my decision, I typed the address into my GPS and was heading across town to 1170 Willow Street. Part of me was half expecting this address to lead me to some creepy basement or an abandoned lot. But instead, I found myself in front of a charming little building that looked like it had been there since the 1930s. Its red door was chipped and worn, but had a freshly painted sign above it, "The Lost and Found." The words looked like they'd been painted by hand, the lettering slightly crooked. Inside, the place was like something out of a dream. Rows of shelves lined the walls, packed with everything from old vinyl records to vintage typewriters, dusty books, globes, and tiny glass figurines. A soft jazz tune hummed in the background, and I caught the scent of freshly brewed coffee and something faintly floral. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 70s with wild, silver curls and the sharpest, kindest eyes I'd ever seen. She smiled as I walked in, like she'd been expecting me. "Ah," she said, giving a small nod. "Lewis's wallet?" I stammered a yes, holding it up, trying to piece together how she could possibly know. "He's a friend of mine," she explained. "He's always leaving little notes like that, to lead the right people here, the ones who need to find it." She beckoned me closer, and before I knew it, she was pouring me a cup of tea in a little porcelain cup with hand-painted roses. "I'm Celeste," she said, handing me the cup. "And this," she gestured around the room, "isn't just a shop. It's where lost things, and sometimes lost people, find what they're looking for." I laughed nervously, but she had that kind of energy that made you want to believe every word she said. "So, what exactly am I here to find?" She gave me a mysterious smile. "Only you would know that. But usually, it's the thing that catches your eye." I began to wander through the aisles, sipping the tea as I browsed. Each item seemed to have a story. There was a pair of ballet slippers with little sequins stitched along the edges, a half-finished knitted scarf, a postcard from Paris dated 1962. I picked up an old camera, turning it over in my hands, imagining the kind of life it had before it ended up here. Finally, on a low shelf near the back, I saw a small, carved wooden box. It was unassuming, tucked between a collection of mismatched snow globes, but something about it made me reach out. I ran my fingers along the wood, feeling a warmth to it, as though it had been held by many hands before mine. Just as I opened the box, I heard Celeste's voice, soft but clear, right behind me. "That was left here by someone looking for closure," she said, almost in a whisper. Inside the box was a tiny silver key, tied to a piece of parchment with a small, faded ribbon. The note read, "For what you need to open, not a door, but a chapter." For a moment, I didn't know what to think. It felt strangely personal, as though the note was speaking directly to something I couldn't yet put into words. "What's this key for?" I asked, glancing at Celeste. She tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's the mystery. But whatever it opens, it's something that only you can discover. I think it's waiting somewhere in your story." I wanted to ask her more, but something held me back. It felt like the key was a riddle only I was meant to solve. Celeste simply patted my shoulder with a kind smile and told me to keep it, no charge. With the tiny box tucked into my bag, I left the shop and stepped back out into the world, feeling like I'd woken from a strange, vivid dream. The sky had turned that golden color it gets in late afternoon, casting everything in a warm glow. I walked aimlessly for a while, lost in thought, until I found myself at a little park I hadn't visited in years. There was a small pond with a bench beside it, and as I sat down, I noticed the reflection of the trees in the water, the way they danced in the breeze. The moment felt oddly familiar, as if I'd been there before, waiting for something. That's when I realized what the key was unlocking. It wasn't a physical lock at all. It was more like a door I hadn't even known I'd closed. Memories came rushing back. Dreams I'd set aside, moments I'd dismissed, the places I'd forgotten in the rush of daily life. And there, sitting on that bench, I promised myself I'd start paying attention, start honoring the little nudges that life sent my way. The key sits on my desk now, a reminder that sometimes the things we're looking for are closer than we think. And every so often, when life feels too predictable, I find myself wondering what might happen if I wandered back to the lost and found to see what else waits for me. So, have you ever stumbled upon something or someone that felt like it was meant just for you, like a little hint from the universe? A key, perhaps, to something you didn't even know you'd lost? It started out as just another Tuesday. I woke up, made coffee, and went about my morning, only vaguely aware that something felt a little off. It was like that feeling when you walk into a room and forget why you're there. But whatever, I brushed it off, put on my coat, and headed out the door, hoping coffee would kick in soon. The first strange thing happened on my walk to work. I was crossing the street when I accidentally bumped into a guy in a hurry. It was the kind of collision where you mutter sorry and keep going. Only this time, he grabbed my arm, looking startled. He blinked, his face going pale, and he said, It's you. From Rome. I froze. Rome? Yeah, like ancient Rome. I don't know how I know this, but we were gladiators. You saved my life in the Colosseum. That's impossible, right? He looked as shaken as I felt, like his mind was suddenly hit with a memory that didn't belong to him. I gave an awkward laugh. Définitivement impossible. We shared a weird, confused look, and then he released my arm and took off, shaking his head. I watched him go, feeling a strange twinge, like he'd unlocked something deep within me that I wasn't ready to face. Still, I shook it off. I figured he was just some guy with a really wild imagination, and I was already late for work. But then, things got even weirder. At work, my first meeting of the day was with my manager, Sarah. She reached out to shake my hand like she always did, but as soon as our hands touched, her eyes widened. She didn't let go, just stared at me, her hand going slightly limp. Sarah, I asked, starting to feel a prickle of concern. You're from Paris, she whispered, her face a mixture of shock and awe. The 1700s. We were painters. I remember you were obsessed with sunflowers. You used to drag me out into the countryside to paint them for hours. She laughed softly, tears welling in her eyes. And you were always late to everything. I pulled my hand back, feeling my heart race. The details she'd mentioned struck a nerve, like an itch in my brain I couldn't scratch. Are you feeling okay, Sarah? I asked, trying to keep it casual. She blinked a few times, snapping out of it. Yeah, sorry. I have no idea why I said that. She laughed awkwardly, but I could tell she was as freaked out as I was. The day only got stranger from there. By lunchtime, I was practically afraid to touch anyone. When I went to pay for my sandwich at the deli, I handed the cashier a $10 bill, and the moment our fingers brushed, he jolted, staring at me in shock. Do you remember New Orleans? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. We were jazz musicians. You played piano and I was on trumpet. He blinked, looking embarrassed, like he'd just come out of a trance. Sorry, I don't know why I said that. Weird, right? I nodded, forcing a laugh, but inside I was spiraling. New Orleans? Jazz musicians? I couldn't play a single instrument to save my life, but for a split second, I had the image of a smoky jazz club, the kind you see in movies, and I could practically hear the notes of a piano under my fingers. I left the deli in a daze, my head spinning. Everywhere I went, every casual brush of skin seemed to bring out some strange memory in the other person, as if we'd shared a life together, just not this life. By the end of the day, I had racked up quite a list of past lives. An old lady on the subway remembered us as neighbors in ancient China, laughing as we climbed a hilltop to watch the sunrise. My coworker Eric, who'd never looked twice at me before, claimed we'd been sailors in 15th century Portugal, mapping out new worlds. Even the barista at my local coffee shop, who I was positive I'd never spoken to before, gave me this strange, nostalgic look and said, "You taught me to ride horses in medieval England. You had this terrible habit of singing off-key, but I loved it. I barely made it home without brushing against anyone, wanting nothing more than to be alone and make sense of whatever this was." But as I closed the door behind me, I couldn't help but feel connected. Like all of these people, These strangers I had bumped into were somehow part of my life, woven into my existence across different times, different identities. The weirdest part? When they shared these memories, they sparked something in me too. Each time, I'd get a flash, a feeling, a scene like watching a dream you barely remember, but know in your bones. There were moments where it felt real, like I was standing right there in those other lives with them. I don't know what this all means, but part of me wonders, could it be true? Have I really lived all those lives? Have we? And if so, why are these memories suddenly coming back to people now, like a forgotten history that decided it was time to be known? That night, lying in bed, I found myself replaying all the encounters in my head. I felt like I was a collection of lives and stories, each with their own chapters and endings. And maybe, just maybe, I was meant to remember them too. So, I have to ask, has anyone else ever wondered if you've crossed paths with someone lifetime after lifetime? Or is this just one very strange Tuesday? I was at this little art gallery on a quiet Wednesday night, tagging along with a friend who thought I could use some culture. The place was dimly lit, full of abstract pieces that made no sense to me, and a handful of people nodding thoughtfully at splashes of paint that, in my mind, could have been done by an enthusiastic toddler. But I didn't mind. I was here to people watch and blend into the background. And that's when I saw her. She was standing in front of this massive canvas covered in blues and greens, swirling like some kind of oceanic chaos. She wasn't just glancing at it, either. She was immersed, leaning forward with a hand tucked under her chin like she was unraveling some secret within the paint. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to say something to her. Maybe it was the intensity in her gaze, or maybe it was the way the soft light from the gallery caught in her hair, but I found myself drifting closer. After a minute of pretending to study the painting beside her, I decided to go for it. So, what do you think the artist was going for here? I asked, hoping I didn't sound as clueless as I felt. She looked over, mildly surprised, then glanced back at the canvas. "It's a mess, isn't it?" she said, and I blinked, caught off guard. Her voice was soft but sharp, like she was making an observation only I was allowed to hear. I mean, I know it's probably supposed to represent something profound, but all I see are paint splatters. I grinned, relieved. "So, it's not just me?" "Nope," she laughed. "Either we're both clueless, or we're seeing something everyone else is too polite to admit." We shared a conspiratorial smile, and I felt a strange sense of camaraderie with this stranger who wasn't afraid to say exactly what she thought. She looked back at the painting, tilting her head slightly. "You know, I read somewhere that the artist named this turbulent minds. What do you think that says about us? That we're part of the chaos? I guess trying to keep up with her humor. Or maybe that we're just really bad at art interpretation?" She laughed again, and it was the kind of laugh that made me want to keep talking just to hear it again. We started moving around the gallery together, exchanging jokes about the more bizarre pieces, like the one that was just a solid black square. Is this supposed to represent the depths of human despair, or just an ink spill? She wondered aloud, and I nearly snorted. There was something easy and light about our banter. Like we'd known each other for longer than the 20 minutes we'd spent in front of surrealist paintings and sculptures that looked more like failed geometry projects than masterpieces. Eventually, we reached a small corner where a single, vibrant portrait was hung, a striking contrast to the abstract works scattered around the gallery. The portrait was of a woman, painted in warm, golden tones, her expression soft, but with eyes that looked alive, almost knowing. We both fell quiet as we looked at it, and the silence felt deeper somehow, like we'd stumbled upon something sacred. After a moment, she broke the silence. "Now this," she said, almost in a whisper, "this feels different. Like there's actually a person behind those eyes." I nodded, feeling a little more introspective than I had a few minutes earlier. It's weird, isn't it? How a face can capture more than 100 colors on a canvas ever could. She glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. Maybe that's because it's simpler. There's no need to impress anyone. It just is. I looked at her then, struck by how she seemed to get it in a way I hadn't even thought about before. There was a wisdom in her words, the kind that made you think she'd spent a lot of time searching for truth in a world full of noise. I wanted to know more about her, to peel back the layers of this stranger who seemed to see right through the superficial. We stayed there a little longer, both of us lost in our thoughts, until she finally turned and looked at me with a small, hesitant smile. You know, I'm not usually the type to strike up conversations with random people in galleries. Funny, I said, matching her smile. I'm not usually the type to randomly critique modern art with strangers. I paused, gathering a bit of courage. Do you want to grab a coffee or something? Continue this enlightening discussion about the absurdity of abstract art. She looked down, as if weighing the offer, before nodding slowly. Yeah, that sounds nice. But on one condition. Oh, you have to promise not to pretend to understand the meaning behind any painting ever again. I laughed, giving her a mock salute. Scout's honor. And with that, we left the gallery, stepping out into the cool night air, which felt refreshing after the stuffy, pretentious atmosphere of the gallery. We found a little cafe a block away, the kind with dim lighting and walls lined with secondhand books, and settled into a booth near the back. The conversation drifted from art to life, to dreams and regrets. She told me about how she'd once considered becoming an artist, but realized she was more interested in finding beauty in the everyday than in creating it. I guess I just don't have that obsessive fire that real artists have, she said with a wry smile. I'm more of an admirer, you know? I nodded, understanding. I get that. I think there's something powerful about just noticing things. Sometimes that feels like enough. She looked at me then, and for a moment, I felt like maybe she saw more in me than I'd been willing to see in myself. We continued talking long after our coffee cups were empty, lost in stories and thoughts that seemed to flow effortlessly between us. It was rare, meeting someone who made you feel both challenged and understood, someone who didn't need big gestures or forced smiles to fill the silence. When the cafe finally announced its closing, we both looked at each other, surprised by how much time had passed. I offered to walk her home, and she accepted with a grateful smile. We wandered through the quiet streets, our footsteps echoing softly. The night was cool, the streets empty, and it felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. As we reached her building, there was a lingering pause. I could feel the weight of the moment, like something important was on the brink of happening, but neither of us wanted to break the spell. Well, she said softly, looking up at me. This was unexpected, in a good way. Agreed, I replied, feeling like no words could capture what I was feeling. I'm glad I stopped to ask about that painting. She laughed, and there was a warmth in her eyes I hadn't noticed before. Me too. I wanted to ask for her number, to see her again, but a strange instinct held me back. Maybe it was the sense that this was a rare, fleeting moment, something beautiful precisely because it wasn't guaranteed. Instead, I simply nodded, giving her a small, sincere smile. Take care, I said, feeling the weight of the words. You too, she replied, her voice soft but steady. And just like that, she slipped into the building, leaving me standing there, feeling both the sharpness of an ending and the warmth of a beginning. I walked home in silence, the city lights glowing like quiet companions, and as I reached my door, I found myself smiling. Some encounters, I realized, are meant to stay as they are. No labels, no expectations, just a moment shared between two people who happen to be in the same place at the same time. And maybe in some strange way that made it all the more meaningful.